Okay. Hello, everyone. Anyone who wasn't here yesterday, I'm Neil Wilkins. I'm head of the Migrant Workers Programme at IHRB. Welcome to the second day of the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment. We had a fantastic day yesterday with lots of really rich discussion. And what was really great as well was watching the very fevered networking that was going on out in the foyer, assisted by lots of lovely cups of tea, coffee, cakes, pastries and all the other things that Clifford Chance provide us with. Just a couple of quick housekeepings. Anyone who wants to ask a question, all questions must be submitted online. This is so that our online audience and the audience in the room can submit questions, but it also enables us to ask more questions than if we ask people to stand up with a microphone. So if after various experiments, we found the best way to do this is go onto the IHRB LinkedIn page, where you'll be able to drop a question very easily into the chat there that will be picked up by Carmen and fed on to Bonnie, who will then ask questions later. Something that I forgot to mention yesterday, so it's just as well that there wasn't a fire alarm. Should the fire alarm go off, the instruction is stay where you are and wait for instructions, and they'll decide where it is in the building and what people then need to do. So if the fire alarm goes off, just do that. Thank you to everyone who joined us last night for drinks at the reception. We told you you'd be better off staying with us rather than going and watching the England game, and it certainly, unfortunately, turned out to be the case. We're going to get started now. We're here graciously hosted in Clifford Chance, one of the world's leading law firms, and so it's appropriate that this first panel, of course, is all about the new legislation. So I'm going to hand straight over to Anna Pinar from the IOM, who's going to be leading us through this discussion. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be with you on day two. My name's Anna Pinar, as Neil mentioned. I am with the UN Migration Agency, IOM. I was previously Executive Director of the Responsible Labour Initiative with RBA. My role now focuses on some of the challenges that we were talking about yesterday, where there is a need for workers but insufficient legal pathways, regulated pathways. So I'm doing part business and human rights work, and then also really working with governments and the private sector to identify where are those needs and where can IOM facilitate those regulated pathways. So it's lovely to be with you all, and I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves. Ray, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name's Ray Lindsay. I'm a partner here at Clifford Chance, and on behalf of the firm, we're absolutely delighted to be hosting the forum. I'm the co-head of our business and human rights practice, so I work with companies in a variety of areas in relation to historically implementing the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, human rights due diligence, and so on. But I'm also very honoured to have had a long-standing association with the Institute for Human Rights in Business, where I'm a member of the International Advisory Council and was formerly the co-chair of trustees. Amazing organisation, which is why we really value that association and all the incredible work the Institute does. So delighted to be here.
Thank you, Ray. Maria Isabel.
Thank you, Anna. I'm really pleased to be here with you in this all-women panel, at least in person. I'm Maria Isabel Cubides. I work at the Consumer Goods Forum, where I lead the Human Rights Coalition, which is a dynamic collective of 26 companies working to make human rights due diligence the industry norm in their own operations and supply chain, and also connecting the people and planet agendas. I'm a lawyer by training in Paris, based in Paris, and also originally from Colombia, where I also practice law, and I've been in the field of business and human rights, initially in the civil society perspective, so giving my members a bit of a hard time sometimes, then came on to CGF to keep on learning in this very complex and interesting field of work.
Thank you so much. Hi, Bart. Good to see you. Would you like to introduce yourself? Wait 1 second. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Anna. It's a pleasure to join you. It saddens me that it has to be here online. I really wish I could be there in London, but that's what it is for now. So my name is Bart Devos. I'm Vice President of Public Policy at the Responsible Business Alliance. Most of you probably know the Responsible Business Alliance as the biggest worldwide industry alliance focused on supply chain sustainability. So our core mission is to help companies drive more responsible supply chains, and my specific role is to make sure we do that in close collaboration with governments around the world, and that in doing so we try to align as much as possible with emerging regulations, including in the forced labor space. So I'm very excited to talk to you a bit later in this panel about our vision on how laws can drive the goals that we all stand for at this event today.
Great, thank you, Bart. So this panel is really focused on the hot topic of the day, which is regulation. And we're going to be discussing, sort of debating whether or not the regulation is pushing further collaboration or whether there are challenges related to that. Just some quick reflections on day one. We talked quite a bit about collaboration. We looked at the panel on Asia, talked about the role of increasing leverage and sort of working with governments, businesses working together to engage governments, but then also asked the question as to whether or not the competition for investment in some countries in Asia is going to actually lead to potential issues related to, are there going to be labor rights protected and built into that, or is there going to be a drive to attract investment, and is that a tension that we need to be aware of? There was also some good examples about specific cases related to joint remediation and how collaborating also with sending and receiving governments can be a good way of ensuring that labor rights are built into those corridors and those recruitment practices. So we hope to really continue the debate today. And I'm going to start by asking just a broad question about where we are now related to collaboration with government, between private sector and government. And so, Maria Isabel, can you tell us some practical examples about how your organization is currently working with governments?
Sure. I want to talk about an example that really speaks to where we are today with, compared to where we were in 2019, so a few years ago. And this is a story about Malaysia. Malaysia was a country that was for the last time ranked as tier 2 in the TIP report in 2017. Things were downhill from Malaysia since then. 2019, companies are hit with WROs, and up to today we have 6 companies that were subject to CBP WROs, and these were millions, if not billions, of costs for both buyers and suppliers in Malaysia. Companies paid over 40 million to repay workers, to improve their housing. Once the WROs hit Malaysia, companies got to work. They didn't deny the issues. They said humbly, okay, we're going to get to address these things. And so they started working themselves, but also together as industry groups or sectors. CGF launched what we call the People Positive Palm Project. And through this project, we train and build the capacity of suppliers, supported them individually in their journey to improve human rights due diligence systems, but also train and engage with recruitment agencies. And as we help companies navigate that journey or start improving in that journey on human rights due diligence and improving their responsible recruitment practices, we realized that our efforts were not enough to have a scale, an impact at scale. And this is where we started engaging with the Malaysian government, because we understood that they were a key piece in the puzzle for the change to happen at a sectoral level and for our ambition of forced labor being eradicated from the palm sector to be actually, truth. So we started engaging the government, and we brought some key messages. We realized in practice that responsible recruitment could improve, but as long as the licensing system of recruiters in Malaysia did not change, then change was not that sustainable and at scale. We also saw the capacity of the labor inspectorate being very weak, and so the need to improve institutional capacity. recruitment fees still being legal to a certain extent did prevent companies going in the direction of eradicating recruitment fees to become less competitive, less with a higher cost to operate. And finally, while trying to enforce labor, we also look at the immigration permits for workers, and so the need to improve worker mobility. And so we started this very difficult conversation with the government in 2022. And just a few months into the conversation, the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, for the first time in a public address, referred to human rights due diligence as a tool that could be an opportunity for the economy of Malaysia to improve resilience, to attract investments, and to make companies, leading example in the region. We're now 2 years later. The engagement has not been easy, especially in a country where governments change overnight. But yesterday, the TIP report was released, and Malaysia was upgraded to Tier 2. Since 2017, they hadn't been Tier 2. So the recognition that the address of the Ministry of Home Affairs yesterday was about, this is an acknowledgement that we are undertaking serious efforts to change the practices of business and the framework in which they operate. It doesn't mean that we have it all figured out. And he acknowledged, the work of those that have taken the hit economically, because they have taught the lessons to the broader group, but also the road ahead and the need for the government to build capacity, to start reviewing the legislations that are setting that environment so that it's more supportive of responsible business conduct, and to monitor and report, to have data about how we're doing in terms of responsible recruitment. So I think now we are in a place where governments are more aware of the value, but also the cost that doing responsible business may have for their economy and for their businesses. They're more aware of the need to collaborate in order to have positive achievements. And so since business have been doing this already for a while, have learned lessons, have already tools that are practical, have examples and pilots, they can bring these to the table so that together we can foster policies and regulatory environments that are informed and grounded in reality and really accelerate and scale that change towards human rights due diligence and responsible recruitment.
That's brilliant, thank you. And it's really highlighting that collaboration is not a nice to have, it's not an option. All of those actions you mentioned, licensing, regulation, labor inspectorates, monitoring and data, all of that requires government action, and it needs to also have the voice of the private sector engaged in that. So that's a really helpful example, thank you. Bart, can I ask you the same question about practical examples on working with governments?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And I'll try to not be duplicative, but there was a lot of interesting in what Maria already said. So for RBA, our collaboration with governments, I think it's the same, is very diverse, both in terms of the geographies that we cover, but also in terms of the nature of the work we do together. When talking about this, I should normally start with Malaysia, because it's one of the countries where we have had extensive programs through our labor initiative, working on focusing on capacity building around ethical recruitment, and in which indeed also the Malaysian government was a key stakeholder. But perhaps to diversify, I want to give a more recent example of the work we are doing in Japan with the Japanese government. So we recently entered into a formal collaboration. We signed an agreement on this with the Japanese government to support the development of responsible recruitment corridors feeding into Japan. And that's really a partnership where we practically are leveraging each other's trainings tools, each other's grievance mechanisms, potentially in the future also each other's standards, and looking at certification, to look at, like the joint industries that are represented inside the RBA, a lot of Japanese member companies, and in the Japanese economy that channel into Japan. How can we help them learn from the experiences we have in Malaysia and transfer that experience to other corridors. At the global level, what we're also doing is using our convening power, leveraging the collective influence we have as the organization that represents hundreds of the largest global companies to advocate for more government collaboration, policy coherence in the forced labor space. Because one of the things that we found when we look back at, where have we performed well and not in the past 3 years is that we clearly see that there's a lot of government industry collaboration that has gone next level, that we do have the willingness in place, that we do have increasingly the right platforms in place, but that there's still very little coherence between those different project spaces, different corridors, different jurisdictions, and that while on paper, most policymakers agree on the need for policy coherence and coherence in the way that governments work with industry, that in practice, we don't always have coherence between those efforts, practical solutions for coherence. And that's why earlier this year as RBA, we hosted a Global Forced Labor Summit that brought together, I think, between 15 and 20 global jurisdictions, both US, EU, Canada, regulating markets, and then also producing countries, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, to talk about practical solutions for more coherence in those efforts. And what we see is that clearly the willingness is there, but it's now time to use the emerging regulations, things like the EU Forced Labor Regulation, CSDDD, UFLPA, to drive more practical solutions to how to bring it together more coherently.
Opportunity there for how to align, the challenges between these different jurisdictions, and sometimes that can be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Maria Isabel, can I quickly come back to you to just reflect on what do you think is working and not working related to these collaborations? Because as Bart mentioned, it's different by corridor, right? You really have to dig in, as you did in Malaysia, to really focus on here's the challenges in this corridor, but there are many elsewhere. What's your reflection?
Yes, well, I think 3 things that worked and 3 things that are still a challenge. First one that worked, I think, engaging as a group. So CGF engaged as an industry group, and this gave us increased leverage, a different voice towards the government. And I'm not saying that CGF voice was the only one or the most legitimate, but it helped us drive that collective voice together, having both the global brands and retailers, and also the collaboration with the local suppliers and the voices of those businesses in Malaysia. The second thing, I think, was thinking about engagement, starting in Malaysia, but also going out to the country of origin where migrant workers are coming. So Indonesia is the #1 country sending workers to Malaysia, and we started in a dialogue also with Indonesia to understand first what are the issues that need to be addressed, for instance, in terms of recruitment fees when workers, or in the first half of the journey of workers that happens inside Indonesia, and then how can we also help them strengthen the message towards Malaysia and what needs to be done jointly. Secondly, the dialogue that we had was always informed by the experience of business who walked the talk. So it was not about we need this or that, just because, but we have an example. This is how it happened for Sime Darby, for FGV, for Top Glove. How could we prevent this from happening again, or how could we do better? And then third one is a challenging one, but still I think a win, is cross-ministerial dialogue. So it's true, when we talk about responsible recruitment, there's no one ministry, human resources, that can deal with it all. It's always a mix between home affairs, foreign affairs, and the thousands of ministries that keep changing names. So bringing everyone around the table, and bringing also the European Union, the Australian Embassy, the UK Embassy, the Japanese Embassy, because we are talking, so that we were not talking as the Europeans coming to bring a new standard yet again, but as something that the global landscape is changing, and this is how we can collaborate together. 3 challenges yet. One thing is preventing the backlash of what these new legislations can create. So that, proactive engagement and talk about human rights due diligence before CS3D comes into force, it help us build that narrative towards a good implementation. Because unless we have the countries where the commodities are coming home from on board in this implementation, it's very difficult for them to be effective. But that's the second challenge, is coming actually from the talk to the policy change is a long road. And we need to take the small wins, but we're really hoping that we can, have a stronger push towards actual policy changes. And there's where I think many factors come in, and many actors need to come together, from civil society to government, around the table. And then finally, how do we navigate a landscape where, the attention or pressure that the WRO may bring at one point may also decrease pressure at another one? And how do we build that awareness and understanding that responsible recruitment is a must all the time, not only when the WRO has hit you, not only when CBP has the eyes on Malaysia, but all the time? Because, and this is about something that we'll probably touch upon later, but is, how do we change the mindset, the business model? Because if we keep operating in the same way, we'll keep having the same issues. And this works both for government and for companies.
That's a fantastic segue into the question I have for you, Ray. So Maria Isabel was really highlighting the need for regulation to create that level playing field and structurally then have an impact, we hope, on actual business models that have been operating in one way for a long time, but legislation can create a more level playing field. So from a legal perspective, can you talk us through some of the many upcoming legislative changes and how you see that, from your perspective, either encouraging or discouraging collaboration between business and government?
Thanks, Anna. Big questions. You've obviously got different legislative approaches to addressing the forced labor issue, with the forced labor bans in the United States, for example, and the one that's about to come through in Europe. And then those bans intended, incidentally, to drive due diligence, because companies have to try to show that there is no forced labor in their value chains. It's been an interesting, I was a skeptic about whether forced labor bans would actually have any effect on workers on the ground, for example. But there have been some encouraging indications from what's happened with WROs in the United States. I don't practice there, but in those instances where they have occurred, they certainly seem to have incentivized some really quite in-depth due diligence and remediation to the extent of having to get rid of forced labor indicators in supply chains at some significant costs, as we've talked about, to companies which have then potentially become insolvent. So how do we balance these, the incentives and the repercussions, and not create perverse outcomes? But certainly it seems to have been a driver for increased due diligence, and also highlighting some of the limitations of what companies do with due diligence and some of the mechanisms that they rely upon. So bringing under the spotlight, as we all know, some of the limitations of social audits and third-party verification. And the fact that these are tools for companies, and they have to be relied upon to an extent, but nothing ever replaces, including in the regulatory environment, the fact that each company is responsible for really knowing its own supply chain and what issues it has there, and actually grappling with the issues. So the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive probably is going to make the biggest impact in terms of hopefully driving these different approaches to due diligence. I had some concern about how effectively a legislator could try and basically translate soft law standards like the UNGP and the OECD guidelines into a legal framework, and it remains to be seen how effectively it's done that. It's obviously not an exact mirror. As John Ruggie said, you can't just take this off the shelf and plug it in. But there are certainly features in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that it could succeed in really driving much more effective due diligence and on a global scale. Obviously, it's got scale back impact on the number of companies that are actually going to directly have to comply, and there have been concerns that it could become a tick box exercise. I think the regulation has done quite a lot to try and build in features that should not allow that to happen. So in order to conduct due diligence, which is obviously the objectives of due diligence, are to identify actual and potential adverse human rights impacts in your value chain, and then to prevent and mitigate harm, and then remediate actual harms that may occur. So the whole intention is obviously to ensure that prevention in the first instance, and then remediation if impacts can't be prevented. The definition of what is expected from companies involves the application of what are called appropriate measures in the conduct of due diligence. And the appropriate measures are identified by reference to their effectiveness in achieving the objectives of the due diligence, which is obviously these prevention, mitigation, remediation outcomes. So to that extent, to the extent that we're going to be looking at companies and whether what they're choosing to do is or is not, or could not be effective on an objective basis, that hopefully will prevent some of the tick box pure compliance approaches that we can expect. Built into the due diligence approaches are obviously a lot of features that we see in standard supply chain human rights risk management generally, so contractual assurances, codes of conduct, independent verification, etc. But again, these efforts to try to ensure that they are meeting these objectives, again, those have the possibility that they're going to take a lot of work. I think this is probably my main thing about the CSDDD. I'd like to be glass half full, but it's going to take masses of commitment, resource, and real effectiveness at all levels to really make it work. And that goes right through from the member states when they implement the directive international laws, to the Commission and the member states when they're creating tools for companies to try and help and support companies and stakeholders to deliver on the legislation. Then obviously companies themselves, with their lawyers and their compliance people hopefully playing a positive role, and how do we make that happen? And then getting together all these various bodies and sources and guidelines that are supposed to help companies along the way. So I think there's some huge challenges. In terms of collaborations though, and collective leverage, again, specific requirements or expectations in the due diligence requirements, encouraging companies to collaborate at industry level and in multi-stakeholder initiatives right through the due diligence process, including with respect to identifying risks, tools on how to deal with those risks, and then through the notification and complaints procedures. Encouraging companies where appropriate to engage or utilize industry and multi-stakeholder initiative tools in their stakeholder engagement. And then as one of the expectations on companies when they're trying to prevent and mitigate and then deal with any impacts that have occurred, an expectation that where they aren't able to address an impact on their own, that they collaborate with other entities, undefined, in order to bring collective leverage to bear in order to achieve the objectives of due diligence. So I think the regulation does a good job in bringing in a lot of components that everyone would say are really important in achieving effective due diligence, including, I'll just add this before I forget it, but when we think about, it's one thing for big companies to be doing this, encouraging companies to go to where the most likely the impacts are actually occurring, to skip over where necessary their direct contractual relationships, to engage with entities further down their value chain, which I know companies do anyway, but encouraging that approach. And obviously, really, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but really, as I say, trying to encourage the approaches that everyone says are needed to work, building them in as expectations, and this idea that there will be supporting guidance and tools at both member state and commission level, including commission being able to facilitate new multi-stakeholder initiatives and industry initiatives that will help achieve these purposes. So if the resources are put in at the commission member state level and then within companies, then you can see this filtering quite effectively through value chains.
In terms of what we were looking at yesterday, how do you see this? Because this is, all of these things are happening and they're going to impact, obviously, companies who are doing business in Europe, but there is going to be this significant wave of global impacts, isn't it? How do you see that affecting? And so, for instance, we were having a discussion on Asia yesterday and internal migration, a lot of focus on India, for instance. So how do you see that then? What should other countries and businesses operating in other countries that are supplying to companies that are going to be impacted by the EU CSDDD, how do you see that rippling out across the world?
Obviously, and this is one of the concerns as to how this will work in practice, is you're obviously going to have a cascading of expectations, including, the company's code of conduct through its value chain. And so one of the concerns, as we've seen with other mandatory regimes in places like France and Germany, is what is actually, there's actually really burdensome impacts on entities down the value chain who can't then comply, or who are asked to confirm that they are complying when everyone has no realistic expectation that they will. So again, this comes back to the effectiveness, the expectation within the directive that companies will support SMEs in their value chain in order to build capacity, and that can include offering financial support to others in their value chain to do so, which obviously would play into the responsible recruitment space. This places a huge expectation on business, and so again, it's going to be about making sure that the responsibility allocation is consistent with the spirit and intent of the directive, and that the expectations are not so unrealistic that we do have the perverse outcomes, which is de-risking in the value chain, rather than actually feeling inclined to go and look for the issues and then be part of the source of remediating them, recognizing that a lot of it has to do with being aware of and sensitive to and working with suppliers and helping them deal with the challenges, rather than sending them rote questionnaires that have meaningless answers.
And actually, we want to avoid any situation where that de-risking actually has negative impacts on migrant workers who are seeking better livelihoods, seeking to support families achieve their goals, and that's ultimately what we would hope to be achieving. Maria Isabel, can I ask you to comment also on how you see the regulations encouraging or discouraging collaboration between private sector and government?
Sure. I think there's fear, and that's maybe the biggest barrier to collaboration. Fear from the legal teams about the risk of litigation increasing as a consequence of the regulation, which is partly true and not. I always see, being based in France and seeing how the duty of vigilance law has turned out, the litigation is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much underneath of what can be done and can be addressed, and so we need to put our teams together, legal, procurement, sustainability, around the table, and everyone having a similar voice of a similar weight, because each team knows, procurement knows the supply chain, sustainability knows what worked and what hasn't worked, and the legals will know the legislation. But so I would really encourage those chief sustainability officers, to sort of push back on how you're held back from that legislative, very legalistic approach, because the CSDDD does, through the adequate measures, give you that, can be seen as uncertainty by the lawyers, but also that capacity and flexibility to act and reflect on what's really going to have an impact. And so I think I agree with Ray. It encourages collaboration to a certain extent, and it encourages collaboration not only within business, but also across governments. I think one of the key important articles is the one that talks about cooperation and the need for member states to ensure that they are cooperating with countries outside the European Union to make this possible. And here's where, going back to Malaysia, sitting around the table, we say, okay, we say that through human rights due diligence, we can create shared value for all. Yeah. Let's show that we are all investing in it. And how will Malaysia do it? How will the EU support those efforts? And how will business bring things back to the table? And I also think there's one thing that was mentioned yesterday about antitrust law and trade secrets law as some of the potential barriers to collaboration. And I think to some extent CSDDD does grounds all the progress that has been made in terms of collaboration in that pre-competitive space, and set some antitrust will always be the guardrails of where we need to operate, but it does set I would say embed the fact that we need and have to collaborate in this space for it to be successful. So I think that's reassuring anyway.
That's brilliant. Bart, can I ask you to comment on that, sort of many of those points there, collaboration between EU member states and source country governments, producing governments, the antitrust question, and the fear of litigation, and whether you think this is driving more collaboration or less collaboration?
So I think that when we talk about CSDDD specifically, and then with it probably most of the other laws that are being mentioned here, that what they create is for us really what we call an actual impossibility not to collaborate, because just the sheer extent and the burden of what is being required means that no one company can do this individually, whether we talk about deploying grievance mechanisms, stakeholder engagement at the scale that CSDDD requires, or whether we talk about, like addressing root causes such as, like diverging local policies and producing countries. There's literally now, because of this law, an impossibility not to collaborate, because doing this in the collective is clearly the only way to get there. Now, of course, whether the legal regime or the key laws incentivize this is difficult to say. I think personally that it's safe to say that CSDDD incentivizes the right behaviors that can drive impact. Ultimately, whether companies will comply with CSDDD in a way that makes it a meaningless and impactless check the box exercise, or an opportunity to deliver and to scale impactful due diligence is largely going to be determined by their own mindset and their own choices. But I do think that by design, what CSDDD mandates companies to do is the right thing, is things that drive impact. And the same applies to collaboration. If you look at the design of CSDDD, I genuinely believe that it does the right thing. That's also why we as RBA stood up and championed on industry side support for adopting the final version of CSDDD. It's an incredible, ambitious law, but it is, in our view, well designed also when it comes to collaboration. So first of all, CSDDD clearly mandates that companies can use industry initiative, multi-stakeholder initiatives, industry schemes to implement key requirements. Then within specific articles like remediation, like grievance mechanism, like stakeholder engagement, the CSDDD again specifically tells companies what's being asked is a lot, but you can do this in the collective. And then even going further and setting sanctions, CSDDD and EFLR as well mandate that the setting of the sanctions should happen by looking and by considering at whether companies have engaged in collective efforts, including for remediation. So something very important when we talk about remediation. So I think by design, very clearly, those laws, contrary to some of the existing laws on the book, do incentivize the right thing. Then, of course, how companies decide to act on this is to be seen in the future. I just want to also mention that when we, for example, ask our membership, is a law like CSDDD gonna make your work, including in the forced labor space, easier or not? We clearly see that 90% of the sustainability leaders in our member companies, and they're the biggest companies in the world, say that those laws will make their life easier. They come with huge burden. There may be inefficiencies from the fact that there are divergences, but laws like CSDDD specifically are recognized as drivers that are going to make the sustainability work of companies easier. Now, that's for collaboration between companies, collaboration with governments. That's where I think that as much as RBA has been championing the adoption of CSDDD, has formally stepped up in favor of the adoption of CSDDD to show that there was industry support. That's perhaps one of the areas where we do recognize that the EU hasn't been doing enough. So I think clearly engaging with governments in producing countries has been insufficient throughout CSDDD negotiations. Whether that has impacts on the design is something that I don't have an official formal position on, but I think that speaks for itself. So I think it's clearly recognized to be an area where now going forward the EU needs to step up the game, and we as RBA actually already started addressing that. So we're now in collaboration with the EU External Action Service, to go into key producing countries, the priority countries from where our industries import most into the EU, to go sit there together in a tripartite manner with industry, with the EU, with local governments, to talk about how are these laws going to impact you and how can we become more collaborative in the way we engage that. I can't say anything as to specific conversations with specific jurisdictions, but just in the past months, we've been doing this in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, in Taipei just last week. And while I will say that the leverage created by those laws in terms of how much concrete policy changes you can drive It's very different country by country because the leverage created by those laws is just not the same when you're in Indonesia versus when you're in Vietnam. There is, I think, a clear awareness from local governments that changes will need to happen for those countries to preserve the attractiveness of the country for the industries that operate there now that the new laws kick in. So I'm optimistic about the positive potential of these laws to drive more collaboration, both within industry, but also between governments and industry.
Great, thank you, Bart. And it's true that there's always this request from the private sector to have that harmonization, which is a wonderful goal, but it's also going to be very challenging. I want to sort of talk about the risks also, the perceived risk from the private sector and how we can really be sort of face the challenges of what this means and how this is impacting the motivation of companies to come forward and sort of talk about the issues that they're facing in light of this new landscape. Would any of you want to sort of reflect on what the perceived risks are from the private sector and how we can maybe encourage that continued collaboration even as these laws come into force?
Well, I think there definitely is perceived risk, and I think if you are a lawyer passing through the CSDDD, there's plenty of legal uncertainty in there, and there is plenty of potential risk on the face of it when you look at the increased disclosure expectations and the diligence processes that will necessarily have to be gone through and documented and retained and then potentially subject to disclosure, and the expanded opportunities for complaints and then enforcement. And so I think there's probably a divide between leaders in this space who have been working with this for a long time and those who may not have started or are in the early stages or have taken a very sort of compliance technical approach to things. Because with more information out there, depending on what the information is, there's always going to be a risk of complaints and potential litigation. I think companies who are leading and who have the confidence in the way they're going about that recognize that you may be challenged, but you can, if you have confidence that you can justify your processes in the way in which you've set them up and you operate them and the outcomes, then you're in a better position, obviously, to meet that if and when it happens. I think there's But there is a lot of uncertainty around this, and I think there is this need for dialogue within many companies, which hasn't happened effectively to date, partly because it just hasn't been a mandatory issue, is how do you explain to your lawyers exactly what you're trying to achieve, et cetera, and then come up with solutions that work, that identify and deal with the human rights risk, while at the same time, very legitimately, dealing with the risks to the company that might be entailed and being aware of what those are, but then, hopefully you're able to navigate and manage those. I think there's a big obligation, obviously, on supervisory authorities and the enforcement. I think Norway is probably a good example where they have a sort of principles-based approach under the OECD guidelines to their due diligence law, and the authorities there seem to have taken a very sort of open approach to talking to companies about what the expectations are, the challenges they're meeting. And obviously this is going to be challenging for many people for a long time. At the same time, given how long it's going to be before this is transposed into member state law, but then quite quickly, coming into effect for some companies, really starting to be, getting on with it, but being confident that there will be realistic expectations and a harmonized approach and coordination between the authorities as to, how to supervise and then enforce and what's needed to support companies, which I think is, is there in the directive, but delivering it in practice is going to be another challenge. And then I think from civil society, obviously important to, hold companies to account, and there's a lot of cynicism in some quarters. But I think, having a strategic approach to any complaints or litigation is really important, because it is having a very negative effect in some jurisdictions. And so there's this sort of, why are we litigating? What are we trying to achieve? Is this actually going to make a difference? Or are we actually going to just drive companies back behind the wall. So I think there's a sort of shared responsibility, and obviously there's plenty of examples of civil society working with companies, obviously, to make improvements in this space. So I think it's enlightenment, understanding what this really is, and trying to make effective outcomes. And as I say, businesses in particular having and being allowed to have the confidence to try and make effective change.
That's brilliant. I love that shared responsibility to ensure that we can continue to collaborate in the midst of the new landscape. Maria?
I really see this in the space of CGF Human Rights Coalition, this very big appetite from our members to have a different way of engaging with their right holders and their stakeholders that is over time, that is sustainable, that is continuous, and not just one-shot engagement. And I think this is really going in that direction of a shared responsibility, of a willingness to address the issues properly, rather than just protect yourself. I think I really like this that you said, Ray, about explain your lawyers what you're trying to do. I think that's the right approach when I was saying, like, let's sit all around the table and talk about the issues very frankly. I think there's the risk would be to put the lawyers only in the driver's seat, because everyone's no offense. I'm a lawyer too. But yeah, we all have a different piece of of how we do business, and we need that comprehensive understanding of the business and the risks and the places where you are operating to be able to do the due diligence right. So I really think, that interconnection that I spoke to about the government is also true at the level of the companies. We are working at CGF to making sure we break those walls as part of making due diligence work and connect the people across functions, because the due diligence is something that needs to be mainstream and embedded across the business. And I would say one of the other perceived risks is about transparency. Yeah. How do we prevent this wave of legislations pushing back on transparency in companies? And I think we really need to show, probably through examples, how transparency is not an opposite, like in a balance against litigation. I don't think more transparency will necessarily lead to more litigation. Yes, you're putting yourself out there when you reveal your supply chain, for instance, but you're also opening the door to collaboration. Yeah. Antitrust cannot get on your way if you are open about your supply chain, because once information is in the public domain, then we'll be able to collaborate. And I will certainly give a hard time to our members on this topic in the coming years, because if we are honestly trying to put our heads together to work towards a common goal, that's necessarily part of the equation. And then the second thing is, I think, and this is why the value of CGF is very important, we are a CEO-driven organization. And so our Human Rights Coalition is sponsored by two CEOs, the CEO of Lipton Teas and Infusions, Natalie Ross, and the CEO of a retail, IGA, John Ross. And they are bringing the ambition and the messages of the Human Rights Coalition to the CEO level. And I think this is key, because here, when we're talking about due diligence and when we're talking about where are companies going to put the resources when implementing their due diligence, this should be a top leadership decision about the business model. Is our business going to invest in preventing risks, in paying for, the preventing the litigation, ticking the boxes, or is our company going to continue investing on those pilots that worked well and that provided outcomes? And so I think the balance, rather than transparency versus litigation risk, is about outcome-driven HRDD versus a process-driven HRDD. And you do need a process, but you should not get lost in it. Remember your business model, and I think that's what the top leadership should be looking at, is let's put our investment in those actions that are showing positive outcomes, because that's how we can make sure that we're investing in the adequate measures and we're making our business sustainably more sustainable.
That's brilliant. And I love what you said about making sure we have leadership buy-in to achieve impact and not taking steps backwards on the transparency. Bart, you're a lawyer too. Can I invite you to, to also comment on the potential risks of collaboration, how that's perceived, and then we'll go to questions. Apologies, I think we're...
Yeah, and yeah, I feel like saying I'm a lawyer is the entry ticket here into getting the floor. So yes, I'm also a lawyer. I try to hide it, but a human rights lawyer, not a competition lawyer. But I do want to comment just on the antitrust I mentioned, because it's an extremely important one, as the fellow panelists have highlighted. And again, I'm not a competition lawyer. Don't pretend to understand all the technicalities of this. But what I do think is important to flag that this is very much on the mind of the EU regulator, and a solution has already been adopted actually last year before even CSDDD was adopted. So there are now updated EU horizontal guidelines on antitrust rules and guidances where actually this situation was foreseen, and the updated EU horizontal guidelines now explicitly clarify that antitrust rules, EU antitrust rules that is, do not stand in the way of agreements between competitors in the space of pursuing sustainability objectives. Those guidelines actually even now explicitly provide a safe harbor for standardization agreements, for example, for industries coming together around code of conduct for sustainability endeavors. So that includes sustainability due diligence. So while I'm not a competition lawyer, can't judge whether those solutions are enough. And of course, I can't predict what their global impact will have specifically within EU jurisdiction. I do think that this is an issue that is being addressed, and through horizontal guidelines like that are now being resolved. But I'd be interested in getting further lawyers' advice on that. On the other risk of, like the laws incentivizing, and it's no doubt, I agree with the panelists, the biggest risk, incentivizing more process oriented focus than outcome based. That's what I think the liabilities are so important. Mandating due diligence, mandatory due diligence, indeed in itself could lead to process-oriented efforts, but by attaching liabilities to it, you actually make sure that companies have an actual stake in the quality and the reliability and the integrity of their due diligence. That's why now, even if it was not in the law, fortunately it is, but even if it was not, our member companies would have committed voluntarily to things like upholding quality criteria for industry schemes, quality criteria for independent audits, because without that, you can't assure the quality, the integrity, the reliability of your due diligence. You risk liabilities, and I think that threat of liabilities being attached to the failure of due diligence outcomes is most of what we need, not all we need, but most of what we need to make sure that those due diligence efforts in the future, way more than today, become impact oriented and not just process oriented.
That's great. Thank you, Bart. And we have 6 minutes for questions. Apologies, Bonnie.
Good morning, everyone. So there were a lot of questions on the CSDDD. I'm going to group them in one round. There are a lot of lawyers on the panel, so I'm not going to come back. So there's a lot of questions around how we can meaningfully do peer collaboration. CSDDD has a provision on companies collaborating to increase their leverage. But there were a lot of questions on how we can do this meaningfully, considering that there are antitrust concerns. We have questions asking, is there any authoritative text that gives companies that want to do this guidance on navigating conflict of laws and different bodies of law? So a lot of questions to get law students' heart pumping. And then we focus a lot on Norway. Norway, CSDDD, the French law came up. But what about some other legislations, that you can comment on? And then lastly, a very interesting question on, does the CSDDD, can it increase better collection of data on forced labor? What do you see as the potential in that? Thank you.
Brilliant. Very meaty questions there. Ray, can I ask you to start on meaningful peer collaboration? What is the guidance on conflict of laws, and talk about other jurisdictions as well that we haven't mentioned today?
Sure. On competition law, that's not my area, but obviously you should have legal advice, and unfortunately, I suppose, so far, I think the EU is alone in having created this exemption for certain types of agreements in the sustainability space, insofar as human rights issues are concerned. So obviously you'd have to be mindful of that in multiple jurisdictions. The difficulty with conflicts of laws is you almost certainly have to comply with all law, well, you will have to comply with all laws that apply to you. So navigating conflicts can be really difficult. I mean, nowhere more so than, you know, in relation to trade issues and sanctions, for example. And you've got a lot of that happening right now with obviously the differences between, you know, the United States and China and how to do due diligence in relation to Xinjiang, for example. So unfortunately for companies, you just have to make sure you're in compliance wherever you're operating and the laws apply to you. And it's not easy sometimes, and you have to make really difficult choices.
Maria Isabel.
I mean, the conflict of laws point could be like a whole class on international law. I would say that, you know, regulations have come in similar directions on the corruption field, on, you know, anti-bribery legislation, on food safety, and, you know, pushing companies globally to change the ways they operate and to understand the global landscape legally. So I think most companies, the bigger ones, certainly in the room, have the capacity to figure this out. We can figure it out together. I just think we need to know where we want to go before we dive into the legislations, because I think lawyers have the power to make out of these legislations many things. And so we can navigate this complex environment, and the outcome will be positive if we know from the start where we want to be. We want to be in a space where we can collaborate, we can actually solve issues where we have a positive impact and are not only focused on process or reporting. That's where we want to go. Now, let's bring our lawyers to the table. How do we make this happen? How do we understand the tools that we have and the limitations? And so I'm quite positive about how, you know, the outcomes are. The future is looking bright, but definitely collaborating. We've collaborated with legal clinics in different universities in different countries, and I think this is part of, you know, interesting initiatives that can help companies and groups of companies increase their capacity to understand law, and to also bring young leaders into this space of reflecting about what are we going to make out of these legislations. And in terms of data collection, I think CSDDD may be less than the forced labor regulation. I think the forced labor regulation has more of that intent and power to collect data and make data available about recruitment corridors and risky products and groups of products and geographies. So I see the data points more there. We need to figure out how to make that data sharing collaboration also work under CSDDD.
Bart, in the last minute. Sorry, Bart, just start again.
Yeah, thank you. And then if just in 1 minute, I just have to pick one, so perhaps the conflict of law topic. I think for our members, that takes two very practical dimensions. One is conflict between EU due diligence laws that apply to them, for example, between CSDDD and the existing EU batteries regulation. Our member companies operate in spaces like the battery space, where there's already sector-specific law. The other dimension is conflict between CSDDD and laws in producing countries, whether it's anti-espionage law, trade and IP law, or diverging substantial standards, for example, on recruitment fees. Those are two different dimensions on which I think it's safe to say that the EU regulator anticipated the issue but didn't properly fix it. What I mean by that is, on the conflict between EU cross-sectoral and sector-specific law, the EU has theoretically solved this by writing into CSDDD that the most stringent rules will take priority, but that doesn't resolve the real challenge, which is that companies active in the same space, depending on whether they're subject to CSDDD or not, will have to follow different rules for the same supply chains being active in the same industry, which is, I think, unacceptable from a political point of view, but which is the reality, despite theoretically there being a solution written in the law. For the other dimension, the conflict with law in producing countries, same thing. The EU regulator has thought of this, has written this in the law. EU CSDD specifically mandates that the Commission will develop guidance to address the situation of how companies can uphold their CSDD requirements while being in compliance with trade law in producing countries. But again, we know that European Commission guidance in itself is unlikely to resolve that practical, real challenge for companies. So has been thought of, but I don't think has been properly solved. And yeah, I think it's one of the key challenges to collectively work towards between industry initiatives and law firms going forward.
Thank you so much, Bart. A lot still to be figured out, I think, is our conclusion. Lots of opportunities, potential for collaboration, lots of risks to be aware of at the same time, and a lot more to talk about than we had in 1 hour. But please join me in thanking our panelists for such a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake and Amy. Hope it went well. I could perfectly see the stage connection worked perfect. I didn't even have that delay that you warned me for the.
Good morning, everyone. I don't know if we've got people online this afternoon, but super good morning to anyone.
Perfect. We're offline, right?
Who's in the US
perfect.
territories.
Yeah. Okay.
My name's Louise
great.
Herring. I'm Executive Director of AIM Progress.
You too. Good luck over there.
One of the
Hope it all goes
sponsors
well.
of this event. Great
Bye,
to
Amy.
be supporting with IHRB and Stronger Together. Those of you that might not know us, AIM Progress is a collaborative forum of 48 fast-moving consumer goods brands and suppliers. We work together to increase respect for human rights and have a positive impact on the lives of people in supply chains. And a number of our members are here today. I'm delighted to be taking us from that very broad-ranging, and for those of us that aren't lawyers, I'm not a lawyer, to put that on the table from the beginning, a legally stretching conversation. I think the conversation that I'm about to introduce, our case study and our speaker, is a really good opportunity to actually think about some of the things we've just heard and think about how they can apply in reality. So Marta's going to talk about a remediation of recruitment fee case study, but think about some of those things that Ray and Maria Isabel and Bart were talking about in terms of what does really effective due diligence look like? What does rights-holder-led due diligence look like? And how can engagement with governments be constructive and lead to remediation? Because I think the case study really does bring that to life. So I'm delighted to welcome to this session Marta Jonsson Stensrud. She's the Vice President of Human Rights and Social Responsibility for Equinor. And Equinor, if people don't know it, is an international energy company headquartered in Norway. Marta's worked in this sector of oil and gas for 24 years and has been, since 2018, responsible for Equinor's corporate human rights and social responsibility function. So great to have you here.
Thank you.
We only have half an hour, even if we end up stealing some of the coffee time, which I might cheekily do with people's permission. So if you do have questions, please get them in early. So Bonnie can wave at me about the volume of questions we have to cover, and I'll keep our questions down. But yeah, whether you're online or in the room, please do get your questions in early. But Marta, we're going to dive right in. Tell us about Equinor's work over the last 5 years to understand recruitment risks in your supply chain. How did this work start? What did you do first?
So thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And can I say I'm an engineer, so I also struggle a bit with all the all the lawyers in this field. Of course, not saying that when we're here at Clifford Chance. No, but of course it's excellent also to kind of bring different disciplines together to understand how to actually do these things now when our field is translating into law. So super interesting, the first conversation. But yes, I'll talk about how we've kind of trying to manage complex issues in our company. So in 2015, we got our human rights policy. And that is basically when we started diving into, where are the issues? And for us, we built a lot of projects. So the supply chain was an obvious kind of candidate for looking further. And in the beginning, we did what I think most do. They do like auditing with the kind of, let's do a lot of audits all over the world and just so that we tick and can report on that. But then we started looking at these like higher risk areas, and we felt that something was kind of wrong because it all seemed like things were, systems in place, the suppliers said that they had kind of, they had everything on paper. And then, of course, we wanted to see the other side of this with the workers. And that's when we started engaging with third-party experts who some of them are in the room, I think, here as well, who really know how to understand the workers' perspective. So obviously, when we started doing worker interviews with the help from third parties, we saw that there was really a big mismatch. So obviously, we accepted immediately that the worker side of it is the important lens. So when we then embarked on our kind of continued journey to further advance our human rights due diligence in the supply chain, that has kind of been the approach. And we've also decided to look for issues where they probably are, instead of just kind of shooting around. So that also means that when we go to sites, we normally find issues. So that has been kind of an important starting point to, of course, to be able to do anything with it. And of course, we are not experts in our company in all of these things. I know yesterday you covered a lot of details on how to do this, but we're trying, we're learning, and we kind of don't like that there are wrongs being done in the supply chain, and we want to improve with kind of outcomes for people as the lens. So that has been a very important kind of starting point.
Great. And in 2019, this approach that you've taken led you to find forced labour indicators and therefore need to move ahead and do something differently. So can you explain, give us the sort of practical details of what happened?
Yeah, so through, again, worker interviews, we identified that quite many, if not all, of the workers at the specific site had paid recruitment fees in one, in various amounts, obviously, as you will find with different nationalities, etc. So with all this kind of data on how many had paid, how much had been paid, we started discussing with the supplier on how to kind of deal with this, with the expectation that this is not right, and something needs to happen in terms of remediation. Now, this, of course, was a long journey with the supplier, because we are talking about a country where this is normal practice. So it's been like this for kind of ever. So why do you have to change anything? And then we obviously discussed with the supplier that even so, this is not okay for us. And we had expectations of suppliers that stated that no worker should pay a recruitment fee. So that's kind of an important, of course, starting point. Now, we used external good practice for this, the universal pay principle, as kind of the foundation for finding out how to do this, and then the kind of negotiation started. So how many workers should be involved in this? What about the workers that have just come in or have left already? And all of these details that you probably know a lot about that you will face. And of course, can you trust the amounts that the workers have said that they have paid? Should you remediate the exact amount of that? And where are the receipts? And all of those complexities. So we found ourselves in this kind of negotiation where we had a kind of starting point, and where we also decided, in order to get any action, to contribute to the financial part of this. So we managed to repay several thousand workers, not everything that they had paid, but an agreed amount based on these international principles. And we did not kind of consider this as a done deal before we had worker interviews confirming that the money had actually been transferred to them. So we learned a lot in this process, and it took a very long time. And we had the project there for a quite long time, so we had kind of the time kind of to also discuss this. This is a huge kind of internal journey as well. I mean, what can you do? We have a contract. It says that they should comply with it, and we say, but we should have known possibly that this was not necessarily the case. So we have some kind of contribution in this, and we should, encourage the change. So let's contribute. And then, of course, comes the lawyers and the business line and everyone. So, but what this ultimately led to was that when we identified a little bit later a new case with quite significant recruitment fees being paid, we had all of this experience to build on. So in that next project, things happened much quicker. And I think this is also important, that you need to allow yourself to kind of go through this journey and to kind of learn and to become comfortable. What does this mean? Can the supplier now come with new kind of requests for things? All of those things that you normally meet in a supplier-buyer relationship. But as you go, you learn, and you also learn the kind of tricks and what to be aware of and what kind of doesn't work. So we find ourselves continuing this journey, and when and if we identify this again, we will have higher ambitions to do more quicker.
Great,
Yeah.
fantastic. And I want to say thank you so much for your openness about the details, because I think it's when we get to the granular, like what do you actually do in the cases and what does remediation really look like? I think I can speak for people in the room and online that that's what people find really helpful. So there may be questions coming through on those. Can I just pick up on a couple of things? So in terms of 2019, when this happened, was employer pays principle in your policies, and that the supplier or suppliers that you were dealing with were clear that there was an expectation? And do you think that expectation was a reality in their minds? Because I think that's something we talked a little bit about yesterday.
So we had just started understanding what this means ourselves, and we had made some kind of overall expectations, right, to the suppliers that, you know, they should all follow. But we hadn't fully understood what it meant, and that, of course, they hadn't either. And what I often say, and I used to work in procurement myself, I say to my procurement colleagues that if you set an expectation or a contract towards a supplier on such a topic, and there is in a high-risk context, and there's no questions coming back, it means that they haven't read it or haven't understood it or do not think that you will enforce it. So you have to have that conversation. So obviously the supplier we're talking about, they also, we did capacity building with them. What does actually employer pays principle mean? What does the UPP, what do they have to do? So this supplier has obviously embarked on a journey to understand what this actually means, and we build a business case for it. You know, imagine that, you know, workers come in, they want to stay longer because they're not in debt, they might work harder. This is a good business for you as well, so that you don't have to turn this machinery all the time. And of course, when they understand they have to repay recruitment fees, they don't want to pay, you know, they don't want that situation to happen, and then it's easier to start thinking about kind of the root cause. Having said that, that's another huge issue, right? What happens in the sending countries? What can you actually do? What about, you know, government-to-government collaboration on kind of migrant corridors? So there's so many complexities. But I think to answer, you know, the supplier did not understand our requirements. They understand it better now, and this is now what we are trying to do in our procurement processes now, is to, if you are in a high-risk context, there is migrant workers going to be employed, we require through our procurement process that you have to have this conversation with the supplier. Do you understand what this means? How are you going to enforce it? What if there's recruitment fees being paid? How do you check? How do you verify? And how do you objectively kind of verify this? Because what we do see, and you probably have examples of that yourself, is that the kind of easy way for the supplier to check if a worker has not paid recruitment fees or has paid is to ask when they come to the site, you know, have you paid recruitment fee? And we of course know that if you're a vulnerable worker, you probably will say no. So when the supplier tells us we have this procedure now, we're doing that, and we're like, not sure that is what we want. So all of these things you have to work with very kind of detailed nitty-gritty with long-term perspective, and in our view, and in a collaborative spirit.
And I think we'll come to more top tips later, but I think that's a great top tip of training your procurement teams to actually walk a supplier through what EPP really looks like and what would really happen. Can I just ask you about that procurement question? So you talked about that Equinor put money into this remediation process. Talk us through the conversations that you had to make that happen as much as you're able to.
In the remediation?
In the remediation, yeah.
Well, we of course talked about the guiding principles. What does it say? and the kind of cost, contributive linkage perspective. You know, I think our starting point was that the worker should at least not pay, or you know, some remediation has to happen. That's the starting point. And then we discussed, you know, what did we do in the procurement process? You know, did we actually do a good due diligence? So that was a part of the conversation. And we also used examples from other industries that had done this. It's like, it's not necessarily a big deal, actually, to kind of help. Because if you're a lawyer or a contract person, you would consider it a big risk to do something like that, because then there comes new requirements for paying this or that, or next time we source with them, they know that we will always kind of contribute. But we tried to kind of put that down, and you know, but you have to have much more solid conversations with your suppliers on these things. And we have a way to go still, definitely in this. But what we have done in the procurement process now is that we have, you know, you start kind of probably everybody with like some kind of screening, and you have your long list of pre-qualified suppliers, and then it kind of goes down to the selected supplier. In this process, you learn a lot about your counterparty, and then you will kind of try to reduce the risk, so that at the time of contract award, you know what you are buying, and you know who that you're buying from. So in our procurement process, in these steps, if it's a high-risk supplier with these types of issues, you shall have a conversation about what we require. There are specific requirements for what you have to ask in the process, written, but also to have a meeting. And then there's also a requirement to have the conversation about whether our requirements have been factored into the price. So this is, of course, a huge, or super important, because if that conversation has happened, okay, so you can confirm, we can shake hands, your price includes that you pay for the recruitment, that you will remediate if there's any recruitment fees being paid, and of course all other types of relevant expectations. Well, if we then find something afterwards, it's much easier, of course, to have that conversation. We did agree. So for us, that has been important to kind of embed this. And we have, you know, tried it in a couple of instances, but this is, of course, how we want to work going forward, you know, in any high-risk contract.
Great, thank you. So, going to take us back to yesterday's conversation when we talked about, you know, what do the workers want, and is recruitment fees top of their list? And I know the answer to this question because we did our prep calls, but I know there are other issues for workers that you've had to resolve. So, can you talk people through what were those other issues you found, and how have you approached tackling those issues?
Yeah, so actually we have just gone through a process now to update our saliency or salient issues. And of course, through all these years, we've been, you know, diving into the complexities of our supply chains. Recruitment fee, of course, or responsible recruitment is an issue. Accommodation is an issue. So I guess everywhere there's migrant workers having to live in kind of predefined dorms in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East, you know, there are problems with that. And then specifically in Singapore, transportation is a challenge, and it's also a quite big complexity. And then take-home pay, wage theft. So I don't do worker interviews myself, obviously, but when we employ third parties to do that for us, it's very often so that the workers are concerned with what happens today and kind of what that they get the pay that they were promised. And when we have done remediation of these recruitment fees, I think it seems like these are sunk costs for the workers, that this is money that they never thought that they would see again. But obviously, if you get it back, you can use it for kind of paying down loan or sending home to your family. So obviously, these are great bonus. But I think that what happens on a daily basis and kind of this continued feeling of being respected and dignity seems to be very important. Yeah.
Great. And so can you tell us a little, I know you've collaborated with others to actually try and tackle some of those issues just identified. Can you tell us a bit about that collaboration?
Yeah, so I think in our sector, energy, oil and gas, extractives, these issues have not been discussed a lot, to be frank. And I think, we know about fashion and consumer goods has been much more kind of involved in these things. So in our peer group and companies that we compare ourselves with, we have like the same policy commitments. We're all like, we also agree at a high level. But that doesn't lead to any change. So in our experience, you have to find your peers in a physical place where there are issues that needs to be resolved. So again, we have found some other peers in Singapore at a few yards that we use there and that are commonly used in the marine sector. Singapore being a big marine hub, and shipping hub. So we have then found each other kind of looking at the same problem and struggling to kind of really create change. Because I think we also are an example that you can achieve something on your own and in a bilateral relationship, but it's really limits to that. So we have found each other there, a few companies, including Shell and BP and Ørsted. So we are trying to kind of do multi-stakeholder engagement to address these systemic issues. So transportation, accommodation, worker voice, and responsible recruitment. So we have created kind of common specific guidelines for that country. And we have along those topics, and we have had several engagements with the suppliers. We've also met with NGOs, migrant worker organizations, and also the government-funded kind of union. So we are trying, and we also kind of have started to understand a bit how to kind of potentially create some change. And I think we talked about it earlier with the legislation that for companies that have to comply with the CSDDD, we need also to know that it is possible to do that in some countries where that are not necessarily the CSDDD is relevant for. So how can you create some kind of positive conversation around being actually an area where we can be, so being kind of a winner in that. So I think this is quite helpful actually to talk about the law that we will have to comply with. And I think the collaboration that we are looking at now is would probably not have happened, at least not now, if it wasn't for the law coming, because you have to work even harder. But I think it also, we have tried to be very open about what we have been, finding and what we have tried and what we have achieved. And I think that is also, encouraging others also to come forward. And I think that is the only way to be able to address anything. You have to kind of agree on the issue and also, of course, find partners that want to help solve them. And we find this possible to do, even though we are kind of competitors, but we are probably not competitors in the same way as in some other sectors, because we have our own specific projects. But obviously, we also know that migrant workers is connected also to cost. So that is a part of the context that we operate in, obviously.
Great. I can see that we've got questions from the audience that we need to answer. I just want to ask you if you could be very brief on this one. Just try and bring it together to the previous session. I know you've already talked a lot about changes you've made to avoid this occurrence, happening, to avoid, the same thing happening again. But could you just synthesize what have you learned from that experience that you've built into your human rights due diligence? So there are a couple of things that you could just highlight.
We have worked a lot to embed the human rights lens into our already existing systems in Equinor. So we have our risk management system is super important for kind of a high, major accident kind of company. So that has been very important. So this means that a human rights risk, for instance, forced labor, is at a very high severity level, needs to be reported immediately and need to be tackled immediately. So this, of course, leads to reporting upwards. The board knows about it. We have to report it externally, etc. So this has been very, very, very important. So we've had that since 2018. And I think overnight it changed from having like 2-3 human rights risks, because we then had to apply the business risk lens to it, to like more than 100. So of course that totally changes the conversation. So suddenly there are many issues that we have to address. So that has been important, and I think the procurement process I mentioned, and we have also tried to focus very specifically on kind of the top issues, and do that from capacity building, processes, internal reporting, and also external reporting, so that we kind of can try to follow one path and not like boil the ocean and try to solve everything under the sun. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Bonnie, over to you, please.
Louise and Marta, we had so many questions wanting to tease out more from your conversation. Even now, Neil tried to whisper something in my ear, so there's a no, Neil. So we have a lot of questions, trying to get you to talk maybe a little bit more on, has there been any follow-up work done on workers who were not hired because the company could not, afford to pay the recruitment fees? Did you notice any change in the company's conversations with their recruitment agencies following intervention? Did it change their culture and how they address the whole issue of recruitment? Another thing that came up is, do you know if the supplier is using the employer pays principle in their contract with all their buyers, or is it, exclusive? And can I pack one more in? Can I take another coffee or leave it?
Do you want to answer those ones, Mark?
I can try. I think, important context, we build big projects in these areas where there is high risk. So it's not like we have these like ongoing contracts all the time. So it's very often like for a longer period, it's a long procurement process, and then it's a long kind of construction process. So that's kind of the context. So we also then try to think about how we can help kind of this journey, actually also when we have left. And then that's where peer groups come in, very important, because there's always somebody buying from that same, or contracting at that same site. So I think that, we were probably the first company that started discussing this in this kind of case study I'm talking about. So what they have learned is basically together with us and with support from third-party experts. I think that they have started also to understand the complexities in the whole recruitment chain and the sending countries. And of course, during their journey now, we will have to hold their hand and have a very tight follow-up so that they actually embed the employer pays principle in a sustainable way that works for workers and do not introduce new risks. So I don't think that we can say that this is implemented. It's something that we really work with now in the continuation. So so I think a world where there's like zero cost for recruitment would be wonderful, but I think there's a long way to that. Yeah.
And the workers not hired, Bonnie,
yep.
As in, yeah.
Yes, so of course we pay attention to that. This may be a risk. I cannot say that we know or don't know whether this is happening, but it's a part of the conversation that they, again, do not kind of ask the suppliers, the workers at the gate, and then send them back if they have paid. So we of course stimulate to that conversation. So I don't know if it has happened, but I cannot say that it hasn't either. Yeah.
Can we do 2 more questions?
No, fantastic. Because perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on, did you have any challenge to companies that didn't want to pay under the pretense that maybe it would make the workers more vulnerable to being exploited, and or that they had paid fees when in fact they didn't? So that was one question. And then the procurement process that you spoke about, is it localized to one context, or is this something that you're using globally?
So again, start with the latter. So the procurement process is our procurement process for all kind of contracting, like these types of projects. So again, it's risk-based, so we've tried to really embed the kind of guiding principles lens to it, so that if there's a high-risk country with a kind of complex kind of procurement, you have to do these detailed steps that I just talked about. But of course, for many procurements, you will not go so far. So that's kind of so it's a global process for all our kind of upstream contracting. And then the second or first question was about...
So challenges of workers saying they paid fees you haven't, and maybe I can bring in, because you said about documentation, that there wasn't a lot of documentation, which is very familiar.
So here again, we rely on the ones that have worked in this field, and that's what we use when we communicate with the supplier. That this is the way to there is so much evidence that this is true. It might not be the exact amount, but you rely on that. When you do those worker interviews, it's really a big sample of workers, right? So it's and you can compare it with lots of other insights. So we fully trust the workers' voice, and that's what we tell the suppliers to do as well. So. But of course, as I said, there is a negotiation. So I think we cannot say that we have managed to get where we wanted, but at least there's something as a starting point. And as I mentioned too, that our ambitions are increasing, which means also that we are putting more pressure on the suppliers. But as we've done more due diligence in the pre-award phase, we can also put much more pressure. So if you haven't done your due diligence up front, you need to kind of be mindful about your own kind of contribution or responsibility.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for the questions online. Thank you to everyone in the room. For those of you that are in the room, Marta is staying with us for coffee, so you can ask all those other granular questions that you want to ask, which I know people will want to. Just want to say a big thank you to Marta. As for the other suppliers we had yesterday, the more openness we can have about case studies like this, I think it's incredibly helpful for people to be able to see the different, in a detailed sense, the different ways that companies are dealing with these issues and what they're learning from them. So yeah, please put your hands together and say thank you to Marta for sharing today.
Thank you. So it's break time. Back in the room at 11, please. Thank you all. Thank you. Okay, we're going to make a start then, please.
Thank you very much, and welcome back, everyone. Welcome to this next session. So obviously we've had lots of fantastic sessions today on responsible recruitment, but in this session we're really going to delve into how we're responding to risk, and specifically how industry is collaborating on that risk. For those of you who have not had the chance to meet yet, my name is Bethan Hunt, and I'm the UK Programmes Manager at Stronger Together, one of the partners at this event. So I look after two of our collaborative programmes. The first is the UK Consumer Goods Programme, working with businesses to take action against modern slavery in their operations and supply chains. The second programme is of particular relevance to our conference today, and that is the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit, which we launched in 2018. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's a capacity building and online self-assessment tool, and businesses can self-assess against 14 standards and one overarching management approach. And these standards are mapped against best practice, many which have come up in our discussions throughout the 2 days, including the DACA principles, which we discussed yesterday. And we now have over 3,000 subscribers. And the tool it's internationally applicable, it's sector neutral, and there is some contextualized guidance for the US, Mexico, and Costa Rica for the agricultural sectors. And businesses can also connect to one another within the tool, so you're able to see partners' progress against those standards that I just mentioned. And if anyone is interested, please do kind of come and grab me over lunch. I've got a bit of information here. And for those of you joining online, please feel free to have a Google of the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit to learn more. And throughout the session, we'll be highlighting other responsible recruitment tools. So we'll be keeping this session in the theme of practical kind of actions that businesses can take. So I've got three fantastic speakers with me in person today. We're all in person. So first up, I'm joined by James Malik, Director at Fruitful Jobs. And next up, we have Henriette McCool, who's the Social and Innovation and Human Rights Manager at Vinci. And then in the middle here, we are joined by Diva. She's the Human Rights and Due Diligence Officer at the UK retailer Waitrose. Just a quick note on how we're going to structure the session. So I'm going to ask each of my panelists an opening question. And then we're going to have kind of roughly 15 minutes to build on these opening statements, kind of really get into those similarities, differences, and the lessons that have been learned along the way. And then I'm factoring about kind of 10 minutes for audience questions. So really encourage you to start firing those in as we go through. And then fingers crossed we'll have time for kind of quick fire closing remarks from everyone as well. So, James, you're up first. So our first question is, what were the new risks that emerged in the UK seasonal worker scheme that the UK horticulture sector identified? And how did industry collaborate and respond to these risks?
Maybe just setting the scene of the UK seasonal worker scheme just very briefly first. I think we touched on it yesterday. Not everyone in the room and maybe watching online is fully aware of the scheme. It's a seasonal worker visa scheme that enables 45,000 workers to come into the UK to work in agriculture with the ability to return year on year. The scheme was set up initially in 2019 and kind of things were pretty good for the first couple of years around a pilot. The reason for the scheme was Brexit and the loss of EU freedom of movement, which the agricultural industry was heavily reliant on. In 22, there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And at that time, 66% of workers in the seasonal worker scheme were coming from Ukraine. and that represented about 20,000 individuals. As a result of that situation, many of those workers either weren't able or willing to return, quite understandably, but it also prevented any new recruitment. And so as scheme operators, and I'll touch just very quickly on what scheme operators do, we had to shift very quickly to new source countries. So in terms of what a scheme operator does, because I think that's quite nuanced in terms of a visa scheme and not necessarily commonplace, we're not just the recruiter. So we are doing the things that you would expect us to do as a recruiter in terms of sourcing labour, making sure they're fully informed, making sure they can make an informed decision about whether this is the right job for them. We're also then responsible for their welfare while they're here in the UK, and that is to look at the workplace, the accommodation, the pay, the treatment by the farm itself. And as a sponsor, we're actually legally obligated to manage those things. Because it's a seasonal worker scheme, we're also moving workers around the UK, multiple farms, multiple jobs at various times of the year. I think this year we're coming back to something more like normal, and apologies to everybody, both my colleagues and clients if I've jinxed it. We're sort of heading back to about 65% returnee rate, which is what we expected sort of pre-Brexit and pre-losing the Ukrainian supply chain. One of the risks that came out of that significant shift to new source countries was the risk of exploitation by actors outside of the supply chain. And there were a number of other risks, but in response to those risks, the seasonal worker stakeholders came together, growers, retailers, NGOs, scheme operators, as well as government departments, to look at how do we manage some of those risks. So one of the things that we've did over the period of 2023 was to really look at worker education. You know, that's vitally important to being able to get workers to make a good decision, because that's what we're reliant on a lot of the time. We of course tell them when they come to see us at recruitment events, don't pay fees, you don't need to pay these other actors. We tell them online, we tell them on our website, we tell them on social media channels. If they don't know who we are, it's already too late. So we have to expand out that messaging. So one of the things that the task force did was to build on the Just Good Work app, to bespoke it to the seasonal worker scheme. And that project had started before the task force, but the task force was really able to put expert opinion into that. This year, we've had over 24,000 downloads of the Just Good Work app, which means that we're really getting some traction and people are really accessing it. And we also work with the IOM to write pre-departure training, and Matt from Proforce touched on that yesterday, to make sure workers are accessing this information. But I think one thing that the task force really did was to bring those people together, because of that need for an individual to make a good decision. If the messaging isn't consistent, we're part of the problem. So kind of over that period, we really looked at, you know, how do we, you know, best inform workers and enable them to make sort of the right decision. I think one of the other things that we then started to really look at was how workers experience the on-farm period in the UK. The recruitment is just the start of that journey. And then they go to a UK farm, and UK farms are not experts in legislation. They're not experts in, you know, all these human rights due diligence processes. They grow stuff so that we can eat. You know, that's their primary function. And we've then introduced to them this really complicated visa scheme with all these new risks in all these new source countries where culturally things are different. And so one of the other projects that the task force really looked at was building capacity in that end user space, so that the end employer. And that was delivered through a number of road shows, both in person or in real life, as it's called nowadays. And online, and it managed to reach sort of 400 plus individuals. And we think there's about 300 farms sort of participating in the scheme. So, you know, it really did have very good traction. And some of the sort of responses to that are that, you know, growers really felt better informed, better able to make, you know, the worker experience really enjoyable and profitable. You know, migrant workers are here to earn money and improve their living conditions at home. The other thing that was a real challenge is access to data. DEFRA run a survey of the seasonal worker scheme, and in 2022, response rate was about 14%, so a reasonable sort of survey. And some of the numbers that came out of that were pretty good. 91% were pretty happy with their recruitment experience, with the information they were provided. 85% plus were happy with the majority of aspects of working on farm. So some really good things. Some things to work on, such as access to grievance mechanisms and then the response to those grievance mechanisms. And while those data points are really good, the challenge was we didn't receive that data until January 2024. Mm-hmm. So the issues being raised in 2022 are coming to us 12 months plus later. So one of the key projects of the task force right now is to build an independent worker survey that will be distributed by scheme operators to all workers. And hopefully that provides us with the ability to get real live data that is not subject to a political process for release. And if built correctly and supported correctly, it'll actually enable us to see, by scheme operator, by farm, what are the real challenges, and therefore we can react to it. I think as organizations, we all want to do something. We all want to do better. But if you don't really know what you're trying to improve, those things are really difficult to manage. I'm conscious of time. And I think we'll come back to the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit maybe a little bit later on. The other key project that's sort of in play right now for the task force is some economic modelling of employer pays principle. So as scheme operators, we don't charge work-finding fees, whether in the UK or overseas. It's not to say that the risk of exploitation doesn't exist, but we are not charging work-finding fees. But the worker is currently paying for their own visa and travel to the UK, so we've not fully embedded employer pays principle. Employer pays principle costs money, and there's a need to really understand what is the impact, what's the impact on food prices. If we make UK produce too expensive, does the production just go abroad? And if it goes abroad, is the worker earning less? Are they being mistreated? Are we creating more problems, more unintended consequences by trying to do something really very good? So I think they're the key things that the task force has been working on over the last 12, 18 months.
Great, thank you, James. And I look forward to pushing you on some of those points throughout the session. If we go to Henriette next, if you could talk about what risks that you've identified in the work that you've been doing around the recruitment of migrant workers in the Gulf region and Southeast Asia, and then kind of similar to James, how has industry responded to those risks?
Yeah. I think that this is a room full of experts who are already aware about the risks, so I'm not going to bore you out with the risks, and I'm going to bore you with what led us to our response to these risks, namely our Fair Recruitment Toolkit, which we published last September with the coalition B4IG, which has now merged into WBCSD, and specifically how this toolkit was the fruit of a kind of failure, but a failure that may prove useful to you and to businesses and actors around the room. So first, a little bit about what led Vinci to work on fair recruitment. Vinci hires 280,000 employees worldwide in its concessions, energy, and construction projects. And while the vast majority of our employees are local, and we have only a very small minority who are migrant workers, the recruitment of workers, and specifically migrant workers, is an issue for us, as has been identified in our Vinci Guide on Human Rights. And it certainly has been a salient issue in Qatar, where Vinci has designed and built large infrastructure projects, and in which I worked 6 years as a CSR manager. And at its peak, QDVC had 5,000 direct workers, and that reached 15,000, counting all our supply chains, subcontractors, and manpower providers. And while today QDVC is finishing its last project in Qatar, Vinci still has a few operations in the Gulf, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and generally around the world, including in Europe. Our project pulled many different nationalities, many different profiles, including foreign workers and including migrant workers. So that's how we sort of got into it. So what was our journey and what led Vinci to develop this toolkit? We discovered a few years ago, 2014, that 90% of our workers in Qatar had paid recruitment fees in their countries of origin to agencies and intermediaries to migrate to Qatar. So the first step was to reinforce our due diligence processes and to do a zero-fee policy in practice and to invest a lot more in the fair recruitment of our direct workers. And then the next step was our supply chain. And we did that mainly, more or less successfully, through labor rights audits, which included workers' interviews, but mainly through a partnership that we did with the ILO, a fair recruitment pilot project in the construction sector, in which we embarked our major manpower provider along the way, and they did embark their recruitment agency in Bangladesh. And that pilot project consisted of an initial in-depth assessment that was done by Verité. Then we did some extensive capacity building with all actors around the room, which took a long year, many sessions in Dhaka, Doha, etc. And then involved the interviews of hundreds of workers in an impact assessment in which we compared a control group with a treatment group. And with that pilot, we reached very similar positive results than what we had done with our direct workers, because 93% of the recruited workers did not pay a single fee through the pilot, and the remaining 7% saw their average fee drop from more than $3,000 to less than 300. So that was a good step, but the next question was, okay, now how do we deploy internally within Vinci this approach and our experience and our learnings and beyond Qatar? And this is what we tried to do with the coalition B4IG, Business to Tackle Inequality. And we analyzed that the keys of success of the ILO project had been to bring many actors around the room. And this is what we tried to do with the B4IG Human Rights Group. So it was Vinci, Unilever, L'Oréal, Schneider Electric, Sodexo, Mars, and Danone getting together to identify a common neighboring country, the UAE. And we started to look for a local partner to replicate the Qatar pilot project, but this time in the UAE. And that's when the challenges began. I think it was after COVID, and I don't think the top priority of our suppliers and manpower providers was fair recruitment. Even though there was the World Expo in Dubai, there was not the same pressure as in Qatar in the preparation of the World Cup. Not the same dynamic between the government and international institutions, just not the same momentum. So while we managed to identify some common suppliers among our companies to do this project, we met some fairly motivated branch managers, but they did not manage to convince their top management, or we did not manage to convince their top management. And after a few calls, many visios, we either got a polite decline or just no news. So we spent months trying to look for the right partner, the right supplier to do this pilot project with us. And after many months, we reached a year, and we realized that our initial project to replicate the pilot project was not going to happen. So we had to reformat our project, and the outcome of which, the main deliverable of which became the Fair Recruitment Toolkit. With one mantra, which was, let's not reinvent the wheel. We know and we knew that there's already a lot of guidance on the subject. So what we looked at was to provide what was potentially missing for practitioners on the ground, using the experience that we had built since 2014 along our journey. So our toolkit, the Fair Recruitment Toolkit for employers and service providers, has three main characteristics. It's sector agnostic, it's open source, and it's been tested with, it comes from the years of experience that Vinci and its partners have had in the region with proven results. So quickly, what is it concretely? Well, this is a reminder of the different steps of the migrant workers' journey and the potential costs for the workers, which you all know. And now, what the toolkit proposes for all the companies who want to recruit migrant workers and to embark their suppliers on the journey are the tools to avoid said costs. So I'm just going to take a few examples. What does a local fair recruitment policy look like? Well, you can download one. If you want to know if a recruitment agency is actually implementing fair recruitment or if it's just lip service, the toolkit proposes an investigation checklist with all the questions that needs to be asked. If you suspect that one of your suppliers could have workers in a situation of bonded labor, a recruitment fee investigation form is available to interview their employees. And those tools can be used either in pre-qualification, as a sort of self-assessment, or as audit form. And if you download the whole toolkit, you'll have access to very simple checklists of, to make sure that no major aspects are overlooked along the way. So, for lack of finding a trusted common supplier, we decided to share our return of experience and practical tools with as many companies and suppliers as possible. So, in a nutshell, here's our journey. I think it's a little bit early to talk about positive impact, but please implement it, see it for yourself, and next year we can compare notes.
Thank you, and thank you for your honesty as well with those challenges. I think it builds really nicely from the previous session around where we bring that openness and honesty to these sessions. We get so much more out of them, so appreciate that, and look forward to some follow-ups there. Last but not least, Diva, it would be great if you could share the risks that Waitrose as a retailer has identified in your own operations and supply chains. And perhaps you could share about how you've been working collaboratively in the sector with your suppliers to promote and support responsible recruitment. Just a nice small question there.
Definitely. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough. So my name's Diva. I work at the John Lewis Partnership. For those that don't know, John Lewis Partnership is a UK co-owned business, the largest of its kind in the UK. And within that, we have two brands. So we have Waitrose, which is our food and grocery brand. And then we also have John Lewis, which is our general merchandise and fashion brand. And I'm lucky enough in my role to look at both of our brands. So you'll get a little bit from both sides today. So when we look at salient risks, what we do is each year we really come together as a team to collaborate and bring ideas together on what we think our current risks are, but what also are the risks that we see upcoming for the next 12 months, 24 months, and possibly a little bit beyond that if we feel like we have the right insight. And where do we bring that information from? Well, multiple resources. So we'll always start with collaborating with NGOs that we always tend to work with, some that may reach out to us through many different means, and some that are just generally talking within the space, and we're doing our own horizon scanning to understand what salient risks they're identifying and whether or not we're seeing that in our supply base. And then we will triangulate that with many other data sources. So as many of you are probably aware, we have a due diligence program, and most retailers do. So we'll use information from that. And then we'll also look at other information from other brands working in the same space as us, and also government bodies, because they're a great resource to understand what they'll be talking about within the space, but also some of that more locale information that as a primarily UK-based team that we don't always get the insight of. In addition to that, we also have industry forums, but that closely aligns with the other NGOs. So FNET is one that we work very closely with. That's the Food Network for Ethical Trade, Stronger Together, and of course, Ethical Trading Initiative. When we do this, we obviously come back with quite a lot of risks. So we have an exercise that we do inside the team to look at the saliency of that. And we kind of look at likelihood and a few other factors in there as well. And we will start to draft a list. So this year we've got risks in a lot of areas, but what we try to do is to frame them back within the ETI base code. So getting a bit technical here, but for those that don't know, the ETI base code is an industry-wide sort of set of principles that we look at to ensure labour standards. And when we present them back, we use the same terminology. So there's 9 ETI base code principles. And just a few of those are employment freely chosen, collective bargaining and freedom of association, child labour, health and safety. And then we will align our salient risks to those and also to the supply chain that we're talking about. So a few examples from this year. So within employment freely chosen, we've identified the seasonal worker scheme within the UK as a salient risk area. I'm sure James has touched upon why. And then we're also looking a little bit at wild fishing within the UK as well. Freedom of association, we've got a little bit more further afield, so we've identified that China is a salient risk for us, especially within the general merchandise space, and then with also within the wages industry. We have bananas within the Dominican Republic, which you might see a lot of retailers talking about at the moment with some commitments there. How do we look at addressing these salient risks? Again, through a variety of means, but responsible recruitment in itself, we have quite direct ways that we look at that, and primarily it is through Stronger Together and responsible recruitment, because we find it's a really great tool to engage the supply base, but also to follow up with that and be able to track and monitor progress that they're making against that. So my task over the last 3 years, I've been in my role for 3 years, was about improving engagement of our supply base, primarily on the Waitrose side, because Waitrose is a bit more familiar with Stronger Together. But how do we look at really getting suppliers to understand responsible recruitment, but also then go above and beyond and start really engaging and doing a little bit more and not just assessing where they're at, not just doing those core trainings. We decided, and I know some people in this room might not be a big fan, but we decided to use policy to do that. We obviously didn't want to just have it as a one point of interaction. We didn't want someone to just go to the training and say, that's it, I'm clued up on responsible recruitment. So we really kind of sat back and thought about how best to engage beyond that initial point of engagement. And again, we use Stronger Together to do this. So they have a fantastic promotion which they do with their suppliers, and they call them business partners. And what that basically demonstrates is that supplier has attended lots of trainings. They've completed the progress reporting toolkit, which I won't go into too much detail about, but they've really spent the time to understand what's going on within their own recruitment channels, what's going on a little bit with their supply base as well, but where are those gaps and what are those next points that they can look at within the next 12 months. And once they do that repeatedly, they get this business partner status, and Stronger Together give them lots of kind of fun stuff to do with that status, and ways to also, again, learn, share, and share bits of knowledge as well. And that's what we decided to include in our policy. So we've mandated the core trainings because that is an aspect of getting to business partner status. But what we've put in there is some really nice initiatives and some incentives as well to get to that business partner status, because we know how much sit behind it. And we know that it's not, as I said, going to be that singular point of contact. It's going to be something that they have to uphold all the time. But on our side as Waitrose, we are giving them incentives to do that as well. And I think that's a really nice balance point about how do you kind of move from policy to implementation. And it is about finding those nuances of, yes, policy does work. I mean, it's not the nicest thing to always talk about, but it does work, and it is well communicated, and people do understand what policy means. So it's getting a bit creative with that, and how do we go a little bit beyond that, but also still talk in the terminologies that our supply base are aware of, and to be quite honest, take seriously with our area of work, because human rights is fairly new within the field. We see a lot more attention on our technical policies. So again, it's a nice way to drive engagement beyond that. Beyond policy, though, we do some other interesting bits. I don't just talk about policy. So we have quite a few supply chain initiatives. And I think some of the talks we've listened to about scaling that up has been really, really interesting. Because I think that is something that we struggle with, or we always try to learn more about how to scale, what's the best way to put yourself in a position to be able to scale. And just some of the projects that we've got going on at the moment. So we have 2 projects going on, one in Malaysia and one in Thailand, with some of our suppliers. So the one in Thailand it was an ambient supplier, and one of the main focus points of that project is looking at recruitment principles. So they've just managed to actually make quite a bit of progress with their supply base, and we're now looking at what principles can we put in place to really make sure that they follow through with that. Some of the supply base are looking at the possibility of walk-in recruitment, and again, really ensuring that we put them in the best place to be able to do that responsibly and ethically. In Malaysia, slightly different, really looking at kind of embedding responsible recruitment within the site, ensuring trainings and capacity building across management, and also weeding out some of the behaviour that we have seen at site that we wouldn't expect to be there, or we wouldn't like within the future of the site as well. So a bit more reactive, where we see Thailand is a bit more proactive, but again, just 2 different ways that we are working with the supply base, where we either think there may be risk or we have identified it already. We have some work within the UK within responsible recruitment as well, but again, it's a completely different way of engaging our supply base. So in this area, we have partnered with 2 different NGOs within the space, so Slave Free Alliance and the Unseen Network, to work with our furniture suppliers. And this was, again, a different way of approaching it, and we only included responsible recruitment as an element of that workshop. But it got great traction, lots of questions, and off the back of that, we now know what areas of responsible recruitment our UK supply base would kind of benefit most from further development or further engagement on, whether or not be a development. So lots of different ways that we engage, and as I said, we are always looking for kind of more initiatives on how to scale up. But I think something that we have learned is when you sort of prioritise the initial stage of the project to be something that can be scaled, it does help a lot more. Some of the projects that we have previously, very specific to a locale, and as you're saying, sometimes it doesn't always work to transfer something that's worked in one geography to another, and that's something that we are learning at the moment. So we have a few other projects going on slightly outside of recruitment, but really helping us to learn what it takes to be able to scale a project up and put ourselves in a better situation for that. I think I've hit all my points. Only other one I've just hit on is we also just starting our work with the responsible fishing vessel. So again, a little bit more Waitrose side. And within there, we'll also start to look at responsible recruitment as well. So again, just another point of how we are trying to weed it into different ongoing projects, up and coming ones, but look at it from a multifaceted point of view. One type of project will not work with this. All of our supply base are in different positions. So being flexible with that, while also having that underlying policy requirement. So yeah, quite a few things going on.
Thank you, Diva. Yeah, sounds like you've got an awful lot on your to-do list. But yeah, really great to hear, and I was really interested that we're kind of moving into the question we're seeking to address around how do we scale the initiatives that we've heard over the last day and a half. So I get a bit of chair's privilege now with some follow-up questions, but a reminder to please submit questions to our great speakers. James, I was going to come to you first, and I think kind of particularly building on Diva's points there around how UK retailers are collaborating through the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit and Consumer Goods Programme. I was just wondering if you could share a bit more about how this has kind of enabled you as a labour provider to access resources, capacity building, and to start to address some of those risks that were coming out in both yours and Diva's opening remarks there.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I think having a platform that's pre-built is super useful. In the environment that we work in, which is food production, which is often, very last minute. We work with a visa process that is often very last minute. It's really good to have something that is there, it already exists, and we can just start mapping what we do against what's already been delivered for us in terms of assessment of best practice, and it's put in a really nice environment that we can do as a self-assessment process in our own time around all the other things that we have to do as a business on a day-to-day basis. I think it also enables us to present ourselves to the industry as someone who's responsible, who is taking these things seriously, and we hope that then brings commercial benefit. A lot of these things come about because a lot of us, particularly those people in the room today and watching online, have an inherent desire to do good. That's why we do the jobs that we do. But eventually you have to have a business case. and the ability to demonstrate to retailers and to our client base in the farming industry that we're approaching these things, you know, in a really, really direct fashion, you know, is super useful. Over the last 6 months, we've gone a little bit further than that. So the self-assessment tool is wonderful, but again, it is us looking introspectively at our own business and deciding whether we're doing good things or not. And after a while, you look at things and you think, of course we're doing good things, because that's what we've been doing for a while now. And so over the last 6 months, we've been through what's called responsible recruitment progress assessment. And so that is an independent assessor coming into our business to assess us against those self-assessment standards. And I think that's been, again, just layering on that capacity that has enabled us to push on again to find additional things we can do in our business, and then to go on to demonstrate further to the sector that we supply that we're taking this stuff seriously. I think it always comes back to that business case, though. And that's a real challenge, particularly in the seasonal worker scheme, because of the way that the visa allocation is delivered. You're given your allocation, and regardless of how well you perform, that's your allocation, and so it limits your growth. And so the business case has to then be about, well, you know, are we protected from significant changes in the global environment? You know, COVID, we reduced our ability to recruit face-to-face. We lost the Ukraine supply chain. We had to go to these new countries. If we can achieve a base level of really good compliance, then as a business we're able to react to these what seem to be more frequent global challenges.
Great, thank you. And Henriette, similar to the seasonal worker scheme and, you know, what James was highlighting there, you've obviously got experience of focusing on that in-depth kind of continuous improvement with kind of a small number of labour providers and agencies. And I just wondered if you could expand on the benefits and challenges of that approach from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. Well, by necessity, it's always easier to start with the small number of labour providers and agencies. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink if it's not thirsty, so you need motivated actors. What has worked in the Qatar case was that we had already started to build a relationship with our manpower provider for 4 or 5 years before they hopped on board with us with the ILO project. And that was done through inspections, audit, through engagement, really. But what's challenging in driving impact at scale, I was about to say everything, everything is challenging, but the very fact that you need to start with the minimal number of motivated actors is a big challenge in itself. It takes a lot of time and energy, and it's only a few actors. Then let's be honest, there's still a lack of demand from responsible actors in the private sector. I'd say a third challenge for Vinci is our sector in itself. The fact that it's a project-based activity means that we almost have to start from scratch in each project, in each country. So that's an added difficulty. And, well, there's one possible course of action, the challenge of which is that it's time-consuming. But one thing I've noticed works was to bring our top management to do some workers' interviews. Obviously, you can't do it every time, and you can't bring everyone. But believe it or not, we have some directors who've been in the region for years, if not decades, and who still have no idea what's going on. I mean, they obviously have an idea of what's going on in terms of their business, in health and safety, in working conditions, social protection, accommodation. But the issue of forced labor and recruitment fees in the countries of origin can be off their radar. And so if they see it with their own eyes, it can have an impact, especially if it happens in their own perimeter. So unlike the popular saying, seeing is believing, actually seeing is understanding. And so time-consuming, yes, necessary, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good point around that accountability and hearts and minds. And yeah, we find in Stronger Together those stories and those personal case studies are just the thing that always cuts through. And then, but it's sad sometimes. I mean, I wish it could be done, in a training or in a conference or just by having a conversation, but it actually takes a lot more. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think one thing that you touched on, which again kind of comes back to our big question, is that challenge in driving the impact to scale that you would want to see. So I wonder, James, if you could reflect on whether you've felt similar challenges in the UK seasonal worker scheme, in that, initially it's those kind of smaller kind of projects, and then what are the challenges to scale that up?
Yeah, I think, I mean, just I suppose going to that point I made earlier about, having, that small number of willing individuals is half the battle. But in actual fact, like with hard work, you can usually find them, and they do exist. But then you realize not everyone's like that. And then that becomes a real challenge, because what you have to do is make this stuff the norm, because that's the way you bring the horse to water.
Carrying on the analogy.
To carry on an analogy. And I think that's where, so, if you take the Seasonal Worker Scheme Task Force, I think it's reasonably rare to have so many people from top to bottom in a supply chain in the same conversation. I think that's super useful, because, it actually enables us to really, talk openly, really understand the issues and the challenges and risks, and therefore present solutions which are actually going to resolve that, as opposed to something that's done from afar. But then, how do you get over that? How do you then get, everybody to make sure you're sort of, accepting that that's the new norm, and that's how people are expected to behave? And I think that's where, there's an element of kind of, that procurement element, the individuals that are choosing the suppliers, the people at the top of the supply chain that can influence those other actors in their supply chain to make other decisions. And I think, you have to show best practice, you have to create the tools, you have to, make it the new norm, then you have to influence and kind of exert pressure in some cases. But then you also have to accept that not everybody's going to want to do those things, and then as an industry we have a decision to make. How do we behave, and what do we do in those cases?
Yeah, how do we get rid of those energy vampires so you can get on with the good stuff? Yeah, thank you for that. And Diva, obviously we've heard a lot of kind of new risks that have emerged over the last few years. So new visa routes, Ukraine, COVID, cost of living crisis has kind of come up in our conversations. And I think one thing that really stood out from your opening remarks is obviously you partner with a lot of NGOs, and clearly that's an important part of you understanding risks. But I wondered if there was anything else that you yourself or as an organisation do to stay on top of those new and emerging risks. What's the kind of magic ball that you can look into and get the next risk kind of underhand?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, no magic ball. It's a lot about, as I say, engagement with all actors in the supply chain, all stakeholders. And it's a bit of a poor answer, but I would say industry forums are really the space to do that. So being here, meeting people, attending regular meetings with some of those organisations that I've already said have been fundamental to us understanding. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we were in Spain as a group of retailers with our fresh produce supply base. And again, talking to suppliers there, you're learning lots more about the things that you just don't learn through being able to go through a SMETA report or a self-assessment questionnaire. And then also using the resources that we do have on the ground. So Waitrose, John, is fairly small brands. We don't have in-country representatives everywhere, but our technical managers are pretty much the eyes and ears that we have on the ground. And I guess to both of your points, having them engage in the conversation, having them aware of what human rights risks are, what does modern slavery look like, what is responsible recruitment, has again allowed us to learn a lot more about our supply chain, which you probably wouldn't have learnt elsewhere. And again, you do find those really engaged technical managers that then push their supply chain to do more, to do better, to go further, and again develops our relations with those suppliers as well. So we have some really big suppliers that suddenly, not within my time, but you see their own human rights teams opening up and their own sustainability teams, and all of this kind of engagement and deeper understanding helps us to understand risk, helps them to understand risk, and ultimately allows us to be a better collaborative group of stakeholders because we are communicating more. But yeah, beyond that, no magic ball, unfortunately, but I would say definitely staying on top of the other brands and the other NGOs within the space has been our biggest.
It's a really good point about the eyes and ears on the ground as well, that those individuals may not be in human rights roles, but how can you kind of empower them to keep track of what's happening. Great, so I'm conscious of time, so I do still have some questions, but I should probably open up to a more democratic form. So Bonnie, I don't know if there is any specific questions at this stage.
Yes, hi, and I'm not touching the mics. So we had a lot of questions. I think I'll start with the broad one, Bethan, and then there's some more looking at the details of what were raised in your individual presentations. So there was one interesting audience question on, mindful of the fact that we're looking at industry, how industry is dealing with the risk of responsible recruitment. Is there a divergence between the state perception of this risk versus how the industry are looking at this risk? And then we had one comment applauding Arietta on how much you have done for the Vinci tool. And then as a follow-up to that, can you talk to us about how Wiley hasn't been adopted? Anything that you could share, I think would be welcomed. And then a question to James on this UK scheme. Is it paid by the employer? Is it all government paid? And have you encountered cases of workers showing up in the farms due to fraudulent recruitments and saying that it was not matching the contract that they were promised in their country of origin? If you have cases like that, can you talk about it and the ways that you have taken to address them?
Great.
Just 3 easy ones, right?
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, from the UK perspective, I guess I can already kind of sense there is, some challenges that we've had with working with the state and the public sector on the UK seasonal workers scheme without preempting too much what either one of you may want to say. I don't know if either one of you wants to kick off with that.
We're a licensed government sponsor, so I have to tread carefully here. I wouldn't say the state is diverging in terms of the risks, in terms of here in the UK at least. I think one of the challenges we have is the speed of movement in wanting to deal with and address those risks. We work with a couple of government departments and getting them to the table has been reasonably challenging. And I also think in the UK we have quite a difficult conversation about migration at the moment. Because the way that it is presented is a sort of a wholesale view of this is migration and it is X or it is Y. And so again, sort of trying to cut through the political challenges of discussing migration is pretty challenging. I think we're getting there. We are getting better dialogue. But I also think that private enterprise is stepping in to fill the void. If you look at the sponsors' obligations, that's state-like in terms of making sure a work environment is safe, checking accommodation is suitable and meeting criteria and requirements, checking that workers are being paid appropriately and receiving minimum wage and receiving pay for all hours, checking they're receiving the right protective equipment, checking that that their welfare is in as it should be. So I think these are all pretty much state-like responsibilities, and so we're filling the void. And similarly with some of the the activities of the task force, they exist because we have to move quicker. And if that's the way it has to be, then I'm fine with that because we have to move quicker.
Great, thank you. And Henriette, your second question was specifically around the tool, and I don't know if any of that just resonated with you around moving quick and clearly putting out a really useful resource to address those risks.
Yeah. About the toolkit, well, let's make things clear. It's one tool among others. It's not the only one. I think it's important to emphasize on the importance of the obvious principle that we need to have this conversation about the true cost of fair recruitment at top executive level, and how this price needs to be integrated in the way that we tender, the different tenders we work on, and in the way that we select our suppliers and subcontractors. I think this is overarching. And then about the toolkit, I think it's a little bit early to talk about how widely it's been accepted. We're deployed. We're slowly but surely starting to advertise it. This is the first step. But it's part of a key element that we believe in, that we actually need to build capacity locally and regionally. And this is what we have started to do, with the publication of the toolkit, but also by organizing some local workshops. We did our first one last month in the UAE. We finally did something in the UAE, where we gathered 35 practitioners from 18 different companies, among which there were a few Vinci subsidiaries and some partners and their suppliers, and some of our suppliers as well. And the toolkit was all around awareness around fair recruitment, but also how to get grips with the toolkit. We did some role play, we did some fake audits and interviews, etc. And actually all the participants were practitioners. We had some general managers, some construction managers, some CSR, human rights officers, who are all, from a day-to-day basis, recruiting, employing migrant workers as part of their operation, either directly or indirectly. So I think and I hope that we got the target right. And then the next step, we really hope to organize the next workshop in Southeast Asia before the end of the year or beginning of next year. We want to do some impact assessment post-workshop, and we're currently developing an e-learning to reach even more practitioners.
Great, so watch this space.
But we're at the beginning, I would say.
Yeah. And maybe an invitation for you to come back next year and give us an update on how it's all
or
going.
in 2 years.
I don't have the power to do that, but I'm just going to say it. And then the last question was around kind of fraud and kind of fake job advertisements. And knowing a little bit from the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, I know that that is an issue that's rising kind of in the UK, people turning up and job doesn't exist, it's a kind of fake advert. So I'm not, James, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's probably two distinct elements to the problem, and they have different solutions in my opinion. So there is one where the worker has been to a bona fide recruitment event, they've been given detailed information, they've also, really importantly, been informed quite clearly that this is the reality. This is, work in agriculture is super tough. It rains in the UK a lot. Retailer orders change, the volume of crop changes, when it needs to be picked changes, there is disease, there's all these factors that can influence and change what was intended. And the way the visa scheme works is that we're processing individuals about 14 weeks prior to arrival, and so the information is delivered at that point, but 14 weeks in agriculture is a very long time and a lot can change. So, to tackle that, we really just need to be very clear with people what they're signing up to, and make sure that's understood, which is quite often the harder element. I've spent quite a lot of time in Central Asia over the last 18 months and been at recruitment events where we've had maybe 200 people in a room and delivering a presentation about what the job is, and everybody in the room will hear something slightly different. Working hours in the UK are between 32 hours and up to 60 hours. And someone will say, 32 hours, that's amazing, I'll do that and I love that. And someone will say, 60 hours is too much, it's not for me. Others will say, 60 hours is what I want every week. They won't hear the average is 42. So I think that's really important about how do we deal with that. And then there is this other element that I think we're seeing sort of more often, and it's not just a migration issue. There's quite a big challenge in the UK of UK-based individuals applying to jobs that don't exist in the UK, or even in some cases doing work for a period of time and then finding out they're not going to get paid because the job doesn't exist. So, I think there's some real challenges. I think with the visa scheme, those obviously are potentially heightened because of the egg being so golden. Probably the best way to describe it. We heard from Matt at Proforce yesterday talking about this 15 to 20x in terms of kind of difference in earnings. The desire to get into the scheme is so huge, and as operators, we need to understand that and mitigate that risk as much as we possibly can.
Great. So I'm conscious that we've got 5 minutes left, and I think it would be a really nice ending if each of you could share a key lesson that you'd share with anyone in the room. You can pick it up over lunch. Anyone seeking to collaborate on mitigating risks. And if you want to tell me when you're ready, so I'm not.
Happy to start, yeah. I can see everyone looking at me. So I would say that the biggest lesson that we have is to really take the time at the beginning to understand, especially when collaborating, the shared risks that you have. And they might be sort of actual risk within the supply chain. It might be this actual supply chain that you are sharing. it might be previous work that you've both done within the space. I know we've spoken about reinventing the wheel a few times as well. But really taking that time at the beginning to understand truly where you can collaborate and truly where those areas of risk are definitely set you up a lot better for kind of subsequent work, and really getting to the root of the issue as well. Because I think, again, what we see a lot, especially within this point within the supermarket industry, is we are starting to see some of the issues that were previously maybe reducing, starting to arise, or some other areas that we want to start focusing on again, and really taking that time to check in at the beginning to understand what has been done, understand where we can collaborate with shared supply chains to go further, has allowed us to do a lot more. It's allowed us to go deeper into the supply chains. It's allowed us to be honest, to get more funding to do certain bits. So, but really taking that time at the beginning has just been invaluable to us. And when we haven't been able to take the time, and we have had to go in, very reactive off the back of something, we've ended up realizing that we probably need to go back again, or maybe a second phase of work. And I think that takes away sometimes from what you really can do in that first stage, especially when it's collaborative and you have the leverage that many of us in the room do when we power together.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, if there's one thing we've learned from our experience, it's the fact that this is a complex issue, and therefore we need some, it cannot suffer improvisation. So I think that it's really important to have dedicated resources, human resources, especially in countries where human rights are at risk, especially when we rely on migrant workers. It's vital to recruit more CSR, human rights, worker welfare, sustainability, no matter what you want to call them, specialists. And just like health and safety has become central in our industry, and it's a reflex that nobody questions anymore, I'd really like if human rights could take the same direction. But I think it is. I think it will. And so yeah, let's try and collaborate to pull our actions where our words are.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think very, very similar. I think what I've seen over the last 4 years have been major shifts in the UK economy, whether that is Brexit and a single biggest change to trading history possibly in my lifetime, although that might change, who knows. And then global pandemics, and then war on European soil. I think, as I said earlier, build your capacity, build it early, build it when times are good, because there is going to be something that you didn't know was coming. And to do that, you must collaborate. You have to be willing to talk, to be open, and to listen, because you will find people that are better at this stuff than you, and you can really draw on that, and you can make your own business better.
Great. Well, I don't think I can finish with a better note, to be honest. So yeah, thank you so much to the three of you for sharing so generously. It was a really interesting session, and yeah, please do kind of grab us over the lunch breaks, and yeah, on to the next session. Well done, everyone.
Well done, everyone. Good job.
Right, we can all breathe.
And breathe, yeah.
you want me to see it?
Right,
Should I take the red?
lucky last, yeah.
That's right.
Oh, good, and the mic is hot. So we have one more panel before you have your lunch. So you've done really well, 1.5 days of the forum. But before we get to lunch, we have a really interesting panel, and I'm very excited, particularly this one, given the work that we do. The topic is ensuring worker voice through the recruitment process. And before introducing our panelists, just to say, my name is Mustafa Qadri. I'm the CEO of Equidem, which is a human rights organization. We're relatively unique in that we do research on labor rights, human rights issues, and global supply chains. But most of our team are rights holders, migrant workers, low-wage workers, which gives us, really unique access to the reality for workers. But also because they're part of our team, they are paid staff, gives them a lot of ownership and representation within our organization. So for us, the work that we do, worker voice is really key. But critically, around labor rights and human rights, issues around recruitment are very common. And as most of you, I'm sure, would know, illegal recruitment practices is a forced labor indicator. So even if there is a focus on responsible recruitment, as we have heard in this conference, in fact, it's the gateway to either a positive experience for people or for a cycle of exploitation. So with us today, we have Paola Camilli. She's the Global Campaigns Director at the Building and Woodworkers International. And next to her is Joe Martinez. He's the CEO of Cierto, an ethical and responsible recruitment firm. So two really interesting perspectives. And if I can ask you, Paola, first to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that your organization does. And let's start with the first principles. Why is worker voice through the recruitment process? Why is that so important?
Sure, thanks, Mustafa. Good to be with you today. Joe, this is going to be challenging. We are standing between here and the lunch break. So in half an hour, and we have to address issues of forced labor. Are you ready for that? We need your help.
we have to solve all these problems in the next half an hour.
In the next half an hour. That's what we are trying to do, and that's probably the answer to your question. And it also links to my introduction of what Building and Woodworkers International is. It's a global union federation. For those who are not familiar with the global union movement, we are an international organization composed by 360 trade unions in construction, building materials, wood and forestry around the world in 117 countries, and they all together represent 12 million workers in construction and building material and forestry sector. We have offices. Of course, we have our member organizations in this 117 countries, but we also have offices in the various regions around the world and in key places in the sub-regions like Philippines, Malaysia, but also India, Nepal, Qatar, and many other countries. So I'm emphasizing this because when we speak about migration, it's of course a big part of the workforce in construction, and having this spread of presence around the world helps us connect workers in the country of origin and in the country of destination and across their migration journey, whether it's one-way return or circular. So again, to your question, or to the question that comes before your question probably, that might be something new for some of you, is why trade unions are dealing with recruitment issues. Right? We are normally used or more familiar with the idea that trade unions are there to defend general workers' issues, and this is the answer actually, because it's about how we approach the issue of recruitment of migrant workers. If we see it as a single model issue or something that has to deal with the endemic labor abuses labor issues in the global labor market. So if we see it as part, or exploitative recruitment practices are seen as part of broader issue of labor abuses that you mentioned, or you called forced labor, and forced labor unfortunately It doesn't come as a big bang, as a big case that explodes all of a sudden. It creeps. It is made of many indicators, many issues that start with illegal recruitment and exploitative practices at the recruitment phase, but then it moves on, of course, creating situation of debt bondage, wage theft sometimes, or most of the times, and and so on, and on and forth. So this is why we are there, and that's one reason why trade unions deal with recruitment, with fair recruitment. The second, and I'll be brief and pass it on to Joe soon after, is because of the title of this session, actually, workers' voice in the process. And I mean, you've been discussing this for 2 days. There's no need for me to reinvent the wheel or repeat things that have been said already. Despite the willingness, despite the good commitments, there is a disconnect between policy commitments and the practice that all of you here in the room and online probably are trying, and all of us here are trying to fill with what we know. And what the unions and the workers' organization can bring into this debate is to make sure, or to try to help, that to close this gap so that the solutions that are thought up are tailored on the needs of the workers. So workers' voice, it's absolutely crucial, it's absolutely important, but it's not enough as well. And here comes my challenge to all of you, and something I'm trying still to find an answer to. So if you can help us move forward from the principle of workers' voice to workers' participation, and participation with agency. What do I mean? We've heard during these discussions how important it is to listen to the workers, to factor in their voices where companies are defining their recruitment policies and monitoring. Who better than the workers actually can say whether the policies work on the ground? Who better than the workers themselves can say what are the challenges that they face? And I'm sure that all of you who've gone around, I'm talking for the employers and the businesses side mostly, but all of you concerned about fair recruitment issues who've gone around with good willingness to speak to workers must have faced a crucial thing, that is the trust of workers. That is their feeling that they can speak with you without fear of retaliation, because if they speak up about an abusive recruitment practice, they might lose their job. Sometimes even language competences or understanding the question, or this trust issue is crucial when you want to get the meaningful participation of the workers. It takes time, and the way for us as trade union to overcome it or to shortcut the system is to allow workers to organize together, because when they are together in an organization of their own choosing, and the speaker before me in the panel spoke about freedom of association and decent work standard, when they are together they can gain that confidence to stand up and speak up for their rights.
Right, that's really an excellent, I think, segue to Joe, and I think some really key points that you've already raised that I'm really keen for us to unpick, and really encourage as well questions at the end of the panel. Joe, over to you. If you could explain a little bit about yourself and your organization. We heard from Paola about the significance not just of worker voice, but of worker participation and agency around trust, and actually knowing what other issues that these workers are facing. Yeah, over to you to build on that.
No, first of all, thank you to the Global Forum of Responsible Recruitment for the invitation. Thank you, Mustafa, for leading this. And I'm excited to share the stage with Paola. I myself, coming from a trade union, from the United Farm Workers in the United States, I'm the 6th iteration in trying to tackle responsible recruitment within the farm worker movement. And with that, that's where CIERTO was born. CIERTO is actually an acronym for Center of Investigation, Training, and Recruitment of the Organized Worker. And I think specifically, Paola touched on those points that we need to commit to, which is trust. Trust can't happen through a transaction. It happens through a relationship. And as a recruiter, which I reluctantly jumped into this industry, my whole focus was to do farm worker rights, stick with the union, and the union asked me, could you focus on creating a farm worker recruitment and training organization? With the premise and notion and recognizing that agriculture in the US, roughly 2.1 million workers back in 2012, 1.6 million of those workers were here irregularly and undocumented, which means agriculture is definitely dependent on a vulnerable population that doesn't know its rights, doesn't know how to navigate systems. And what we want to understand is, how did those workers migrate to the United States and end up in these situations? So Cierto was born and created as a nonprofit recruitment and training organization with offices in the United States, Mexico, and Guatemala, with a focus on community-based recruitment and ensuring that workers fully understand. One of the things that we have to be sure is that a worker cannot pay for the right to arrive to a job. The second that they've paid, they're no longer going to fully engage. They're focused on paying off that debt. They're no longer focused on making sure that they're harvesting that product to the best possible way, ensuring that they're abiding by the employer's needs, because it's all about survival. We're human beings. We all understand this. So with that, Cierto really focuses on spending our time in the communities of origin, conducting a 10-module training. Anywhere from what is a recruiter to what is the visa that you're traveling with, what are your rights, listening skills, conflict resolution, continuous improvement plan, understanding the supply chain. And I say this because when we talk about agency, most of the time, migrant workers don't know where they're going half the time. They don't know the job at hand. With Cierto, they need to know exactly what they're doing before they leave their home. And they need to be committed to it. Because what we're dedicated to is recruiting professional farm workers, professional migrant workers that are going to come and partner with their employer to be able to improve the supply chain, improve economic efficiencies, and overall demonstrate that responsible recruitment, when done correctly, is not just a social sustainable issue, but an economic driver for change that can help alleviate rural economic poverty in the countries of origin and continue to improve our supply chains, our brand integrity, and continuity of supply.
That's pretty fascinating. And I like the idea that, firstly, you have the experience from your trade union background, that realities that you've seen. But then, in terms of root and branch, addressing effectively the supply chain and due diligence, it sounds like from what you're saying, it can't just be a process, but it's actually about creating concrete systems. And we heard from other panelists as well about, you need to be driving the support within the ecosystem of that. I'll come to you, Paolo, in a sec about this too, but staying with you, Joe, can you tell us a bit about some of the good practices that you've seen?
Yeah, well, first of all, jumping into this industry, it's not one that's easily done, and it's a challenge. And I think there's a key word here. It's an ecosystem. How do you develop that ecosystem and engage with the actors to ensure that you're putting in the best practices? So Cierto's been very grateful to be able to collaborate with the International Labor Organization, their Fair Recruitment Initiative, been able to collaborate with the International Office of Migration, their IRIS certification, which we're currently in the process of and have finished the first phase, and alongside with Stronger Together and other folks in this room. We recognize that there's not one model that can solve it, but how do we have a continuous improvement process to bring workers to the forefront? And recognizing that for workers to have agency, they need to truly and fully understand what they're doing, what they're committing to, and recognize that their voice is going to be heard. And so in that instance, involving one of these practices is we really dedicate ourselves in creating a verification process that's predicated on worker voice. And when I say building that trust, it's a relationship, it takes time, we see it as a 2 to 3 year bell curve with any employer. That first year when we're doing this verification survey with NGOs and human rights organizations on the ground in our communities of origin, it takes time for workers to tell you the truth. They're like, I don't know, is this going to work against me? Am I, as a recruiter, going to blacklist them if they speak up? Are they going to be held responsible? Am I going to retaliate? Is the employer no longer going to request them if they bring up issues with human resources and grievance mechanisms? All of these things are tested. And to give you just some quick real examples, in our first year when we brought workers, they said, oh, well, could we have a barbecue pit so that we could cook some food on the weekend? And you're thinking, oh, well, that's something simple, no big deal. And then all of a sudden they see, oh, they did it. And then all of a sudden they start to ask for other things. And then slowly over the course of the second and third year, they start to say, well, you know what? The farm manager or the housing manager brandished a gun towards me and told me that I needed to stay quiet and I couldn't complain about the hot water going out. And it's that information that may not necessarily come to the recruiter or the employer, but who does it come to? The family, the community of origin. and the actors that we have in those communities of origin that then feed us a continuous feedback loop to be able to provide that data and information to the employer so that we can try to prevent these issues from becoming systemic and endemic. I'll be honest with you all, we're never going to eradicate trafficking, exploitation, debt peonage. But can we create frameworks within the countries of origin that help us identify them before they expand and become systemic to someone's supply chain?
I mean, to sort of ask you a question, so based on what you said, it sounds like what you've set out there requires time. You mentioned sort of 2 to 5 years, and you and others have mentioned before it's a complex system that you're dealing with. How do you make sure that, particularly the employers, the business community, other stakeholders, stay the course? Because particularly nowadays, everything is so rapid. Often people don't have an appetite for that long-term investment. So how do you ensure that is the case? But again, just trying to aid discussion, but it sounds like what you're painting, the risk is that there are so many things you have to factor in. It can easily be off balanced and the thing doesn't work properly.
No, I think it's a huge risk, and that's why as a recruiter, I stand by my recruitment process. And I think that what we're really trying to demonstrate in Cierto is what it takes to conduct ethical and responsible recruitment means to have a true knowledge of the candidates that you're selecting, understanding their realities and explaining to them where they're going. And so if we want full integration, we really take a strong step in speaking with employers, trying to understand the culture and the vision for their company, and translating and facilitating that to the workers that are going to be selected. And in turn, yes, it is a relationship. It's going to be a back and forth. It's going to take time. But overall, what we have been able to see with the clients that we're working with, and I'm excited to share that we've now been working for over a decade, and we now have some actual documented proof to demonstrate that this is actually having a workforce that's actually going to be more retainable, lowering absenteeism and abscondment, and actually improving productivity. And at the end of the day, when we've been speaking with our employers within the US context, is if you can help us increase productivity anywhere from 4 to 7%, the true cost of responsible recruitment is covered. And so in that framework, we've actually been able to demonstrate with some of our clients where we've been able to demonstrate that productivity can increase from 2 to 7% year after year, with the retention rates increasing, with folks coming back around 90 to 99% with the folks that we work with. And it's that type of dependability and responsibility where workers now start to see and say, hey, I can actually create a career out of this migration. And I think one important aspect for workers having agency over there is seeing a migration as a means for them to fulfill their dreams and have self-actualization. So a huge part of our training isn't just understanding where you're going and what you're doing. What's the purpose of this migration? What is the dream of Jose? What is the dream of Aldo? What is the dream of Maria to be able to create for themselves so that they can retire from the need to have to migrate and be away from their families? And how do we partner with organizations in the community of origin to see that to come fruition and have employers document the impact of what they're doing and creating the positive outcomes for their workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really powerful because, ultimately what you're talking about is, seeing workers as actually partners in the business, and the scope for actually changing people's lives is huge. The workers themselves and obviously their dependents as well. Paula, so you mentioned when you started talking about, moving from worker voice to participation. Talk to us about the experiences that BWI has had in terms of obviously identifying when unethical recruitment is happening, but seeking to address them, and why, in your view, trade unions, not just worker voice, not just some form of worker representation, is critical to addressing it when you find those practices.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mustafa. I was just reflecting on what you two just said. I mean, one of the first sentences you said is that building trust is not a transactional issue. So it comes from a dialogue, and that dialogue takes time. That's exactly what you've said when you echoed his point, saying workers can be partners. So it can't be seen, they shouldn't be seen as passive agents, but active agents with their own dignity that can sit at the table and find together a solution. So here is another key element for us, which is the willingness, the political will actually, to sit together and look in the same direction to find a solution. And if you look at workers not as a passive group who should be given rights, and of course they should be protected, and but they have their own voice, their own needs, and their own perspective on things. So if you treat them with dignity, and that means also from our side as trade union to work a lot on building that capacity and confidence to speak up and dissipate their fears and all the things you said before, Joe, if they can sit at the table with the same dignity as the employers, so as a group normally, that's why they organize into trade unions and they don't negotiate or bargain individually or alone, then the best solutions, the win-win solutions can be found both for the workers and the companies, as you said. So that's the basic principle. But then, again, you went on touching on issues that refer to redressing fundamentally unbalanced power relations between employers and workers. And this is a systemic issue. We can try to spot or single out situations where we found and support, of course, the workers in this, where right now, where we found abuse, right now we are handling or we are supporting legally more than 150 workers who were recruited in India, transferred to Serbia to work for a US-based company, and of course through a legal recruitment process they had to pay recruitment fees, and we didn't know that until union members, Serbian union members, entered the site and found these workers and reported these workers to the
sorry,
union.
the figure's 150,000 people.
No, 150.
150.
150.
Which is still a very large number.
Working in a US-based company, same number working for a Chinese-based company
Yeah.
in the same city, in the same region. So we can spot these cases when workers are on the site, when unions are on the construction site, report it and try to solve it and get the workers. Of course, these workers were also withheld their passports, they weren't being paid their due wages, and so on. So all the, as we said before, all the elements of forced labor that come together when you find there's flesh in the pan, a situation that is so shocking that you have to activate the communities, the workers, because again, if you are a worker in a country of destination, you might not feel so confident to speak about your problems or the debt bondage situation you're in, but you might feel more confident to speak about your community members or people back home. And that's why creating this connection cross borders and with the communities is absolutely fundamental, and working together with other organizations is too. I mean, trade unions can't do work alone. They don't operate in a vacuum. They, of course, negotiate with employers, and I appreciate very much, for example, the commitment of employers construction companies, also here in the room, who've gone through the process of sitting down with trade unions, giving equal dignity to the workers to get to international framework agreements, for example, in the case of Qatar, that also entail training of workers, raising their awareness, building their capacity to spot issues at the workplace, because there is where also issues of recruitment will come out. And if auditors or inspectors come for a short time, 1 day, 2 days on a site, and then they leave, who stays on the site to continuously monitor what happens day by day? So there is where the agency of workers and their openness or that confidence to speak out comes out. And again, trade unions, workers are on the site, but I spoke before about the situation in Serbia. While it was a worker, a trade union member, who spotted the situation on the work site, trade unions couldn't raise enough public pressure to raise the issue outside the workplace without human rights group and NGOs joining together with the trade unions and try to speak about it and to report about it. So Mustafa and others here in the room are very much aware that we have a very similar case involving more than 20,000 workers in Saudi in Saudi Arabia who've been waiting to be repaid their due wages for 10 years now, so it is quite a fair amount of time to get your wages repaid. And again, if you're speaking with these workers, from all the testimonies, having your wages withheld goes together with having gone through a recruitment process that is not fair and not ethical. So yeah, these are just a few examples to say, of course, we got to protect the workers when these situations arise and support them in their legal case, in trying to get a remediation, trying to get the recruitment fee repaid. But what we are also looking at is the non-repetition of the issue. And this is where trust, dialogue, negotiation, treating the workers' representative and the workers' group with the same dignity as a partner, actually, and as employer, and working together is needed to make sure that not only you remedy, but you also redress and make sure that the situation of abuse doesn't happen again.
Thank you for that. So we have a few minutes left to take some questions. I understand that some questions we have from the audience.
Yes, two quick ones. So first of all, I just want to kind of disagree with Paul a bit. We
Oh,
have
there you
a
go.
panel on complexities after lunchtime. So I think that's a much tougher sell than this panel. Imagine coming back for complexities after lunch. So, all right, two quick questions. One is for Joe. Following on previous round of questions, that's trying to understand more of these granular details on how we can do ethical recruitment. So one question on if candidates are rejected in your recruitment process, how are they treated and how are they informed? And the second question is a broad one. How do you build trust in the supply chain when the power is so imbalanced, as you said?
Questions? Joe, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so first and foremost, when we go through our recruitment process, we do have some very clear indicators on what's required to be a candidate for a recruitment practice. We don't do open recruitment. We do a closed recruitment process. We select communities specifically through various databases that help us identify the best possible candidates in areas that have experience within the commodity or the area of work. Then we overlay that with a level of NGO, human rights organizations, and religious organizations that may be present within the community of origin. So that when we enter a community, we know we're engaging with folks that actually live there, belong there, and know what we're there to do. And at the same time, if there's an individual that is not eligible, for instance, if we're able to receive their information, I found that they have had previous issues with immigration on the way to the US, we will inform them and try to give them an opportunity to be able to be part of a different recruitment process, maybe internally in Mexico. And so the notion for us is that they're not just out and we leave them alone. It's like, how do we partner with them to give them other opportunities that maybe not might be susceptible for the programs that we're offering? On those same lines, unfortunately, we can't provide it to everyone, and there are times that there are workers that join our recruitment processes hoping to game the system, to learn of our approach so that they can then go out there and mimic us. And so we have to be careful on multiple different fronts, right? The reality is that vulnerability and corruption are always going to be present when there's vulnerable populations. And so we can't be naive to that. But at the same time, we predicate ourselves on being able to walk hand in hand with workers and being able to also connect them to other organizations within their community of origin that might be able to provide a path forward.
Thanks, Joe, for that. And Paola, maybe you can take the second question, and Joe, if you want to quickly say anything after her. But how do you build trust across the stakeholders around worker voice in the recruitment process?
Yeah, shall the next panel on complexity take this question after lunch? Exactly.
After lunch, yeah, that's
no,
the critical
I'll
point.
try to be clear. Of course, we don't have the magic bullet for building trust. It takes everybody's willingness to sit around the table and identify solutions together from the inception. And I want to insist on this because you can't find with a solution and expect the workers to feel ownership of the solution if they're not part of it from the inception. Then there are many other regulatory steps that can be taken, but of course they have to go hand in hand with inspections and implementation. That's always where the main challenges are. And I mean, they are specific by sector. If I look at construction, we have very long subcontracting chains, and this is where the abuses mostly are found. So why not limit subcontracting, for example? It takes, again, political will, and once it is done, and in some countries they are trying to, it takes enforcement and implementation. In other countries it's just not possible because the interests to deregulate and liberalize the subcontracting chain are just too strong, and that's where the power imbalance unfortunately is, and that's why it takes all hands on deck to and the help of everybody to sit around the table and build systems that are resilient, that serve the workers and that serves the employers. There is one challenge I want to leave you with for your lunch. Ukraine will require, the reconstruction of Ukraine will require 100,000 workers, which are not available right now in Ukraine. That means there will be mostly migrant workers. And as the plans are made right now, maybe it's also too soon to speak about reconstruction, but there are discussions about reconstruction of Ukraine. What time is now to think about how to recruit these 800,000 workers and build systems where the worker's voice is tailored in from the onset. Procurement, investors, everybody can leverage its own share of power to make sure that standards are decent, that workers' rights are protected from the recruitment phase to the employment and sometimes the
entire cycle. It's really interesting because, and we have to close off now, so thank you so much, but just to say very quickly that, you know, hearing you both makes me think of the fact that in many ways you're talking about actually democracy in the workplace. You're talking about, you know, you have workers, people have citizens' voices to an extent to complain about their local community, but when you're a worker in a transnational supply chain, often you don't have that. So really key points. It's such a shame we only had half an hour, but also we don't want to keep you away from your lunch. You've all been brilliant today. So please join me in thanking Paola and Joe for a really thought-provoking discussion. Thank you. No, it's a pleasure. Always a pleasure. We could have kept going, I think. Yeah. Lots to discuss there.
So 1 hour for lunch, back in an hour's time, please. Thank you.